Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I'll never forget the first time I saw that silhouette by my neighbor's front door. It was around midnight, and I was tossing a bag of trash into my bin on the curb. I glanced to my left and saw a figure with the same posture and build as my neighbor. The porch light was off, but I recognized his height and the way his shoulders sloped. My heart gave a quick jolt because I didn't expect him to be home. He'd mentioned something about a trip earlier that day. I live in a quiet cul-de-sac. There's a short row of houses on one side and a row of houses on the other. Mine is the second from the corner, and my neighbor's place is directly across from mine. My job keeps me up late. I do some freelance work that involves irregular hours, so I'm often awake when most people are asleep. I've gotten used to the sounds of distant traffic and the hum of the streetlights, but I'm not used to seeing someone standing in the dark for long minutes, barely moving, near a mailbox. That's what made me notice him the first time. I looked away to close my trash bin, then looked back, but the porch was empty. I assumed he went inside. No big deal, I thought. I went back into my house, switched on the TV, and tried to unwind before bed. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was a little off. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe the neighbor's schedule changed, and I just wasn't aware. But I remember I still felt a mild tremor in my hands when I poured myself a glass of water. I wasn't sure why I was anxious. It didn't make sense. A man standing on his own porch isn't usually strange. The next day, I woke up close to noon. I stepped outside to get my mail. I saw my neighbor pulling out of his driveway. He waved and I waved back. He seemed normal. He's always been the polite but distant type. We don't chat much beyond small talk. I was about to ask him if he was back from his trip, but he drove off before I could say anything. I let it go. I made coffee, checked my emails, and started my day. A week later, I spotted him again at night, standing in the exact same spot. It was around 11 p.m. I was at my window letting some fresh air in before I started another late work session. I saw his shape in front of the house. The streetlights illuminated him from behind, which gave me a clear outline. It looked just like my neighbor. He seemed to be smoking. I heard a faint crackle like someone flicking ash off a cigarette. I thought about calling out to him, but I was in my pajamas, and it felt weird yelling across the street. So I just watched him for a moment. He took a drag, or at least it seemed that way, and then he moved to open the mailbox. He flipped it open, paused, then closed it. He stepped back toward the door, disappeared into the dark corner near the porch light, and that was it. I didn't see him re-emerge. I assumed he went inside. A few days after that, I got a letter in my mailbox that wasn't mine. It had my neighbor's name on it. It wasn't the typical junk mail. I saw some official markings on the envelope. I decided I should return it. I walked across the street in the late afternoon. I pressed the doorbell. No answer. I waited a couple of minutes. I rang again. I heard no movement inside. I started to feel a slight tension in my stomach. Usually, if he's home, he comes to the door. So I slid the envelope under the door and left. That same night, while I was stepping out to grab a package from my porch, I glanced over to his house. Once again, I saw a figure. It was around 10 p.m. The figure's head was tilted the same way my neighbor's head tilts when he's reading something or looking at his phone. There wasn't any phone light though, so it was just the angle of the head that got my attention. This time I walked to the edge of my driveway. I didn't cross the street, but I stood there looking directly at the figure. My skin felt cold. I noticed my breathing was short, like I jogged a short distance. I could hear my heartbeat thumping in my ears. I tried to steady my breathing. The figure turned slightly, as if it noticed me. It was too dark to see any face. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt tight. Then the figure stepped back into the darkness of the porch. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I stayed outside for another minute or two, listening. The only sounds were a distant bark from a neighbor's dog a couple of houses down and the soft buzz of a street lamp. I didn't hear any door open or close. I went back inside. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I locked my door. I checked the windows to make sure they were shut. I don't usually spook easily, but I found myself double-checking every lock. I stayed up that night, scanning across the street a few times. I didn't see anything else. When I went to sleep, I had trouble getting comfortable. My sheets felt clammy. My pulse was still hammering. At some point, I managed to drift off. The next day, I saw my neighbor drive home around lunchtime. I decided to go over and ask if he got the letter I left for him. I also wanted to mention the times I thought I saw him at night. I walked over and greeted him as he was removing groceries from his trunk. I kept it casual at first, just talking about the weather and how it had been chilly at night. Then I asked if he'd been traveling. He looked at me, a bit puzzled, and said he had been gone for 4 days last week. He stayed out of town for some business, and he only got back 2 days ago. That timeline matched at least one of the nights I'd definitely seen the silhouette. I told him I'd tried returning his mail and rang his bell, but nobody answered. He said he'd been away, so that made sense. I felt a creeping sensation in my spine. It wasn't just a slight overlap of confusion. I'd clearly seen someone on his porch during the period he said he was gone. My neighbor seemed genuine. His voice was calm. He even thanked me for dropping off the envelope. I asked if anyone had access to his house while he was away. He said no, that he lives alone, and nobody else has his keys. He didn't look worried, but he did seem curious why I was asking. I decided to keep it simple and said I thought I'd seen him outside once or twice. He shrugged and joked that I might have been mixing him up with the guy who lives one street over, who has a similar build. But there's no mixing them up. I know what my neighbor looks like. I know how he stands and the way he angles his head. The figure I saw was exactly the same shape, same posture, same tilt. It wasn't a random stranger or someone of a similar height. It matched him exactly. I tried to stay calm about it, but inside I felt uneasy. That evening I tried to focus on work. I kept looking out the window. I was jumpy. Every time a car's headlights swept across the front of his house, I felt my muscles tighten. It got so intense that I decided to step out onto my porch around midnight to see if anything was going on outside. The street was quiet. I stared at my neighbor's porch for a few minutes. Nothing happened. Then I heard a soft scraping sound, like someone's foot dragging on the concrete. I turned my head sharply. It seemed to come from behind my neighbor's house, near the fence. I didn't see anyone. My heart was pounding. I wiped some sweat off my forehead. The air felt cold on my skin, but I still felt a film of sweat forming under my shirt. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't have a clear reason. I hadn't seen any crime. I'd just seen a person who looked like my neighbor, but maybe it was some intruder messing around. I didn't want to risk looking paranoid or calling them for no solid reason. So I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. Over the next few days, I didn't see the silhouette. I started to think I'd overreacted. Then one night, around 2 a.m., I heard a mailbox squeak. I recognized the sound because mailboxes in our neighborhood have those metal doors that get rusty over time. I glanced out my bedroom window. The street was dim, but the lamppost gave enough light for me to see a figure standing at my neighbor's mailbox. My heart kicked up again. I got out of bed and pressed my face to the window, trying not to make any noise. The figure was opening the box and closing it repeatedly, almost like it was stuck in a loop. I couldn't figure out what it was doing. After a moment, it stopped and stood still. I felt my skin prickling with goosebumps. My stomach felt hollow. I decided to grab my phone and step outside, but I wanted to be cautious. I put on some shoes, slipped out my front door, and crept to the edge of my driveway. The figure was still there. It had the same outline as my neighbor. My hands were shaking. My phone was in my right hand, and I considered taking a video. Instead, I tried turning on the phone's flashlight. That's when the figure turned its head in my direction. I froze. For a few seconds, I just held my breath. Then the figure retreated behind the porch. It moved fast, like it knew I was there. I stood in place, shining my flashlight across the street, but it didn't reach that far. I heard nothing else. It was quiet again. My legs felt weak, so I sat on the edge of my porch for a minute, staring at the house. I wanted to call my neighbor, but it was past 2 a.m. I didn't want to freak him out. Or maybe I did, but I just sat there uncertain. The next morning, I got up early and watched my neighbor leave for work. I jogged across the street and checked his mailbox. It was empty. I looked around for footprints, but the concrete walkway doesn't hold prints. Everything looked normal. I went back to my house and tried to focus on work again. I couldn't. My mind kept jumping to questions about who or what that figure was. Later that day, I caught my neighbor outside, rolling his garbage bin to the curb. I marched over, feeling nervous but determined. I asked him straight up if he'd been outside at 2 a.m. checking his mailbox. He told me he'd been asleep and had no reason to do that. He actually got annoyed and said he's not a sleepwalker or anything like that. Then he told me he has motion sensor cameras installed at his back door and the side of his house, but they don't cover the front porch fully. He offered to show me the footage to see if anything weird popped up. I accepted. Inside his house, which I'd never actually been in before, everything looked tidy. He led me to a small office area where he had a monitor. We checked the times I mentioned. The camera showed nothing unusual in the back. He scrolled through the side camera footage. It just showed darkness with no movement. There was no sign of anyone creeping around. He looked at me and asked if I was sure I saw someone. I told him I was certain. He shrugged and said maybe it was an illusion or someone cutting through the yard. He seemed more confused than anything else. I tried to read his expression, but he seemed genuine about not knowing what was happening. I apologized if I came across as a busybody, and he said it was fine. He said if I saw anything else suspicious, I should give him a call or maybe call the police. I left his place feeling unsettled. My palms were clammy, and my throat felt tight. I was convinced something wasn't right. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights off, looking out the window. I wanted to see if that figure returned. Around 1 a.m., I caught movement from the corner of my eye. I stood up and walked quietly to the window. I saw the silhouette again. It was standing at the same place in front of my neighbor's door, leaning over the mailbox. My heart started beating so hard that I felt it in my chest. My fingers felt numb. I reached for my phone. I dialed my neighbor's number. It rang. The silhouette turned its head slightly. My neighbor answered, sounding half asleep. I whispered, "Go check your porch right now, I see someone." He said, "Okay, hold on." As I stayed on the phone, I watched his front door. About 10 seconds later, a light turned on in the hallway behind the door's glass panel. The silhouette remained there for a split second, then moved away. The door opened and my neighbor stepped out, holding his phone to his ear. I saw him wave his other hand around, looking for someone. But that shape was gone. There was no one there. I never saw it walk away or run off. It just vanished. My neighbor looked across at my house. I could see the confusion on his face. I stepped outside and called, "Did you see anything?" He said no. He sounded annoyed and a little on edge. I apologized again. He went back in. I felt foolish, but I knew what I saw. I went to bed that night with a tight knot in my stomach. I was sure something was messing with both of us. In the morning, I got ready for my day and tried not to dwell on it. I kept telling myself I wasn't crazy, but it was difficult. I noticed I was more jumpy in my own home. Every small noise made me glance at the windows. Over the following week, I checked the porch every night. For a while, nothing happened. Then on the 6th night, around midnight, I looked out and saw the silhouette again. It was the same height and had the same stance. This time, I decided to do something different. I opened my front door and shouted, "Hey!" as loud as I could. I saw the shape jerk upright like it was startled. Then it vanished into the darkness near the side of the porch. I was shaking with adrenaline. My mouth felt dry. I considered running across the street to chase after it, but I worried about what I'd do if I actually encountered someone. Instead, I just stood there, scanning the darkness. After a few moments, I didn't see or hear anything. I backed up into my house and locked the door again. I didn't call my neighbor this time because I didn't want another awkward conversation. The next day I checked with him. He said he heard me shout but didn't get outside in time. He asked what happened. I told him I saw the same figure. He looked pale. He admitted that he didn't know what to think anymore. He joked that maybe he had a secret twin he never knew about. But I could tell he was rattled. We agreed to keep an eye on each other's properties and call if anything else happened. After that, it became less frequent. I caught sight of the silhouette only one more time. About a week later, again very late at night. I shouted again, and it disappeared. My neighbor eventually added a motion sensor light to his porch and put a camera there too. Since then, I haven't seen it. The tension gradually lessened, and life moved on. But the memory still gives me chills whenever I walk out to check my mail at night. I sometimes feel the back of my neck get stiff, and I'll glance around, half expecting to see that shape again. My neighbor and I aren't exactly friends, but we're more familiar now. Sometimes I'll see him in daylight and he'll nod to me or say hello. We don't talk about the silhouette anymore. I sense it still bothers him, but neither of us knows what to do about it. It feels like something beyond a casual explanation. I don't have a perfect ending to this story. It just happened, and we both lived with the weirdness for a while. Now I sleep better, but sometimes late at night I'll wake up and check the window. I still half expect that figure standing by the mailbox with the same tilt of the head, looking just like my neighbor. It's quiet now, though. No sign of it for weeks. But I can't say it's gone for good. The memory keeps me alert. I keep my phone by my side and my locks secure. This street used to feel so ordinary. Now it has this edge of mystery I can't quite shake off. If I ever see that figure again, I'm not sure what I'll do. But I'll be ready to shine a light straight at it and confront whatever stands on that porch. And if my neighbor's double shows up again, I'll make sure there's proof this time. Until then, I can only wait. I never expected my father's voice to show up again. The day it first happened, I was sitting in my living room around 2 a.m. I was exhausted from a long shift, and I wanted a few minutes of peace. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. That's when I heard it. Soft, hushed, almost like a breeze across the room. A quiet whisper that said my name. I froze. My eyes snapped open, and I stopped breathing for a moment. The sound was inside the headphones, but it wasn't music or static. It was a voice. I lifted one side of the headphones off my ear, and everything went silent. No whisper. Nothing. The minute I placed the ear cup back, I heard it again. It felt impossible, but it was there. It said my name in a familiar tone, almost like the voice I remembered from my father when I was younger. But my father was gone. He died years ago. There was no way this was real. I ripped the headphones off my head and tossed them on the couch. My heart pounded so hard I could barely think. The living room felt hot, even though the AC was running. I walked around to the window, pressed my palms against the glass, and just tried to slow my breathing. After a minute or two, I picked up the headphones again. I put them on, expecting to hear the same sound. Instead, there was only silence. I sat there for a while, eyes flicking around the room, scanning the shadows by the TV stand and the corners near the sofa. Nothing moved, and no one was there. I chalked it up to exhaustion and decided I should probably get some sleep. But it happened again the next night. I had the headphones on and was listening to some calming ambient tracks. Suddenly, in the middle of a track, the music faded, and I heard a whisper. It was so faint that I almost missed it. Then it started saying disjointed words. I could swear it was something like "come here" or "listen," but I couldn't fully catch it. It didn't last long. Then the music came back as if nothing had happened. I took the headphones off. Once again, total silence outside. My body broke into a light sweat, and I felt goosebumps run up my arms. I turned all the lights on in the living room and stayed up until it got bright outside. Over the next few days, I tried not to think about it. I went to work, came home, and avoided using those headphones. But around a week later, I was tired and I wanted to relax again. This time, I thought I would try my headphones with some random device in my bedroom. I closed the door, turned out the lights, and sat on the edge of my bed scrolling through my phone. I connected my headphones, put on a white noise app, and closed my eyes. A few seconds passed, and then I heard my name in the same faint whisper. My entire body tensed up. The whispering got a bit louder and repeated a few words. It sounded like stay or wait, and I'm sure I heard help once. My hands started shaking. I yanked off the headphones. Immediate silence. I tried telling myself I was probably just tired or dreaming, but it was too consistent. The voice had the same tone every single time. It sounded eerily like my father. There was a soft rasp in his voice when he was alive, and I heard that same rasp in these whispers. I needed to test it more directly, so I waited until the next night and tried my phone with a different pair of noise-canceling headphones, my old backup set that I rarely used. I sat in the kitchen, turned off every appliance I could so there was no hum from the fridge or anything else, and put them on. After a few minutes, there it was again. It was faint, but I caught it. A whisper, a soft exhale, calling my name. It made my skin crawl. I looked at the time on the stove clock. It was around 2 in the morning. I started to notice a pattern. It only seemed to happen when I was really worn out, especially late at night. It was almost always around 2 or 3 in the morning. Sometimes I tried to stay up on purpose just to see if it would happen again. It always did. The voice would say my name or utter random phrases that made no sense. Sometimes I'd catch a few words. Other times, just my name repeated over and over. Each time, as soon as I took off the headphones, everything stopped. No sound in the room at all. I began to worry that I was losing my mind. I scheduled an appointment with an audiologist to check my hearing. The tests came back normal. I told the doctor I was experiencing random sounds, but I didn't go into detail about the voice or how it sounded like my father. I could tell the doctor thought it might be stress or fatigue. He recommended more rest and maybe less headphone usage. I didn't argue. I just nodded and left. For a couple of weeks, I tried to avoid the headphones altogether. I watched TV without them, listened to music from a speaker, and tried not to isolate myself too much. I figured if it was some strange glitch, it would go away. But it didn't. Whenever I got tired enough and decided to try the headphones, maybe late in the evening after a rough day, I would still hear it. The whisper never failed. Sometimes it came after only a minute or two of silence. Other times it sneaked in after 15 or 20 minutes of music or white noise, and it always vanished when I removed the headphones. After a month of this, I started feeling anxious whenever night came. The second I'd see the clock edging toward midnight, I'd feel a knot in my stomach. My hands would get clammy. I'd pace around my apartment, flipping lights on, then off, trying to calm down. But there was a strange pull, too. Part of me wanted to hear the whisper again. Part of me hoped I'd catch a full sentence, maybe something that would make sense. Because that voice wasn't just anyone's voice. It sounded like my father. Sometimes I'd try to speak to it. I'd whisper back. But it never answered in real time. It would just repeat bits and pieces like an old recording that didn't fit together. There was one night when it seemed louder. I remember it clearly because I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth with the headphones playing some ambient track. I had them on just to drown out my noisy upstairs neighbors. I wasn't even thinking about the whisper. Then, all of a sudden, it burst into my ears, louder and more intense than before. It said something that sounded like "help me" or "help." My heart rate shot up. I spit out the toothpaste, nearly dropped my brush, and almost tripped over the bath mat. My mouth went dry and my forehead was slick with sweat. I yanked off the headphones and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I could see the wild look in my eyes. My lips were parted and I was breathing hard. I remember thinking I looked half crazed. I tried to calm down, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I ended up grabbing my phone and searching for any rational explanation. Maybe interference, maybe some radio signal. But I found nothing convincing. Even if it was interference, why would it say my name? Why would it sound like my father? None of it made sense. I felt cornered by this thing, whatever it was. One night I decided to record it. I opened my laptop, plugged in my headphones, and set up an audio recording program. I sat on my couch, turned on the noise-canceling feature, and waited. I tried to keep my eyes open, but I was so tired that I began to doze off. Then I heard the whisper again. It was so close that I jerked upright. I tried not to move too much, hoping the recording would pick it up. It kept repeating a few words in a raspy tone, but I couldn't piece them all together. Something like, I'm here. Help. My chest tightened. I pressed stop on the recording and immediately removed the headphones. Silence again. My hands trembled as I played back the audio. All I heard in the playback was soft static. The whisper wasn't there. It didn't record. I tried boosting the volume. Nothing. It was as if the whisper existed only for me and not for any device to capture. That discovery shook me even more. I remember pacing around my apartment, lights blazing, curtains drawn. I felt like the walls were closing in. My body was exhausted, but my mind was on high alert. I locked every window and door, even though that made no sense. I guess I just wanted some control. Eventually, I lay on the couch without the headphones, trying to slow my breathing. Hours passed before I slept. At work the next day, I could barely focus. My boss asked me if I was feeling all right. I lied and said I was fighting off a cold. I drank coffee after coffee, but I still felt the weight of what happened the night before. I felt like I was walking around in a fog. All I could think about was that whisper, that unmistakable sound of my father's voice calling my name, asking for help. I wondered if I should speak to a therapist or someone who dealt with auditory hallucinations. But I couldn't shake the idea that this wasn't just in my head. It felt too real. One weekend, I invited a friend over to hang out, watch a movie, and maybe help me test the headphones. I was determined to see if someone else could hear it. We waited until around 2 a.m, which was when the whispers usually happened. I told my friend to put on the headphones and listen to silence or some quiet track. I watched him carefully. He sat there for a while, eyes closed. But after a few minutes, he shrugged and pulled them off. He said he heard nothing out of the ordinary. No whispers. We tried the same thing with another set of headphones. Same result. He didn't hear anything. After he left, I was alone again. As soon as I tried the headphones, the whisper returned just like before. Soft, raspy, insistent. It repeated words I couldn't fully understand. My pulse quickened and my breath grew shallow. I took the headphones off, feeling numb and sick to my stomach. There was a night when I tried to endure it longer than usual. I wanted to see if the whispers would become clearer over time. I sat in my bedroom with the lights off, headphones on, and waited. I watched the clock on my nightstand flip from 1:59 to 2 a.m. Then it happened. At first, just a light hiss, then the whisper, my name. A few words I couldn't catch. My eyes began to water. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to keep the headphones on. The voice paused, then repeated something like, help, or hear me. Then I felt a strange sensation on the back of my neck. It was like a slight chill, as if someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I whipped off the headphones and jumped to my feet, scanning the room. No one was there. My clothes clung to my back with sweat. I realized my legs were shaking. My heart was hammering so hard that I could hear my pulse in my ears. I noticed I was gripping the headphones so tightly that my knuckles were turning white. I had to sit down on the floor to steady myself. At that point, I decided I needed a break from my apartment. I packed a small bag and drove to a friend's place out of town. I told them I just wanted a weekend getaway. I didn't mention the whispers. I left my headphones in my trunk. I spent 2 nights there. I felt normal. No voices, no strange experiences. I slept better than I had in weeks. But when I returned home, the sense of dread hit me the moment I walked back inside. The place felt too quiet. The air felt still. That night, I tried to avoid using the headphones, but I couldn't keep away from them. Part of me was curious, and maybe part of me hoped it had stopped. Around midnight, I sat down on the couch, took a deep breath, and put them on. My hand trembled as I powered on the noise cancellation. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, as the clock neared 2 a.m., I heard it again. My name, quiet, but clear. My stomach twisted. I felt like I might throw up. The whisper repeated itself. I whispered back, "What do you want?" No response, just static and faint, jumbled words. My throat felt tight, and my eyes stung with tears I was holding back. I sat like that, headphones on, heart pounding, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I snatched the headphones off and flung them onto the coffee table. Then I slumped forward and buried my face in my hands. Since then, I've tried living with it. It's not every night, but it happens often enough. I don't have an explanation, and every test or recording I attempt leads nowhere. I've tried different devices, different rooms, even different apartments when I travel. If it's after midnight and I'm worn out, there's a chance I'll hear it. The whispers call my name, repeating fragments of phrases in my father's voice. I can't get rid of it, and I can't prove it to anyone else. It only shows up when I isolate myself with noise-canceling headphones at that late hour, like it's waiting for me in the darkness. And that's the truth of it. I'm sitting here, telling you this, because I need someone to know it's real to me. I don't have fancy words to describe how it feels, and I don't have a big conclusion. All I know is when I put on those headphones in the middle of the night, I hear my father's voice whispering my name. And no matter what I do, I can't shut it off. I'm sitting in my living room at 2 a.m. staring at my sofa. My heart is beating fast and I'm gripping the armrests of my chair. The lights are off, and the only glow comes from the television. I can't concentrate on the movie. I'm too busy watching that spot on the couch, the same spot that freaked me out last week. I keep glancing at it, expecting some sign of movement. Tonight, I decided I wouldn't leave the room until I finished my drink and snacks, but I already need a refill. I'm thirsty, and my throat feels dry. That spot on the sofa makes me uneasy. I guess I should explain how this started. About a week ago, I was staying up late flipping through channels. I do this a lot. I like the quiet at night. The building is peaceful, and the neighbors make less noise after midnight. I got hungry and went to the kitchen to grab a bag of chips and a soda. It took me maybe a minute or two. When I came back to the living room, I noticed the center cushion of my sofa. It looked pressed down, as if someone had been sitting there. The shape was clear. I walked over and put my hand on it. It was warm. That freaked me out right away. The seat felt as if a body had been there only seconds before. I glanced around the room, but there was nobody else in my apartment. I tried to brush it off at first. I thought maybe I had just gotten up and left a warm spot behind. But I usually sit on the right side of the couch, not the center. I don't remember sitting in the center that night. It was strange. I walked around a bit, paced back and forth, then sat down in my usual spot. My show was still playing, so I forced myself to stop thinking about it. It's easy to doubt your own memory late at night. I figured maybe I just forgot where I had been sitting. The next night, the same thing happened. I had been watching a show until around 1 a.m. I went to grab a glass of water and a few cookies. When I returned, the cushion in the center of the sofa was lower again, as if someone had plopped down there while I was gone. I stared at the sofa for a good few seconds. I didn't go near it at first. I just stood there. The living room felt too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded louder. I heard a faint noise from the hallway, maybe a neighbor closing a door. Everything else was still. I forced myself to walk over to the sofa and touch the seat. It was warm again. My arm hair stood on end. The warmth felt recent. I pressed down and felt the fabric. It felt like a dent that was shaped for a human body. It wasn't a random crease. My throat felt tight, and I started to sweat. I checked every corner of the apartment. I even opened the closet and looked behind the curtains. Nothing. On the third night, I decided to test this. I watched some late-night talk show. I put the remote on the coffee table, got up, and walked slowly out of the room. I left the door ajar and positioned myself so I could see the couch through the gap. I had a partial view. The door was open just enough for me to see the center cushion. I held my breath, waiting. My heart was pounding. I heard the TV in the background. I heard my own breathing. Then, I saw it. The cushion sank a bit, like someone lowered themselves onto the sofa. It wasn't a big, dramatic drop. It was a slow dip, about the same depth as a person's weight. My chest got tight, and I felt like I forgot how to breathe for a moment. I squinted, trying to see if there was anything in the air or a shadow, but there was nothing. It was just the cushion moving. After a few seconds, it stopped. The spot stayed sunken. I didn't know what to do. I just kept watching, my hand on the door, my fingers stiff. Then I swallowed hard and decided to walk back in. My steps were slow. My legs felt shaky. I pushed the door fully open. The couch looked normal except for that dip. My breathing got heavier as I inched closer. I touched the cushion. Warm again. My fingers tensed up. The fabric felt soft but hot, like someone's body had been there for a while. I couldn't think of any explanation that made sense. It scared me. It also felt embarrassing somehow, like I was losing my mind. I ended up grabbing my things and going to bed. I didn't watch another minute of TV that night. The next few nights, I tried different approaches. One night, I set up my phone to record video while I left the room. I put the phone on a shelf facing the sofa. I turned off the overhead light so it wouldn't reflect on the phone's camera. Then I walked out. I left for maybe 2 minutes. When I came back, I checked the video. I saw nothing. The cushion didn't move on camera. It stayed normal. I felt relieved for a moment, thinking maybe it was over. But that night, when I actually got up for a bathroom break, the cushion had that same dip again when I returned. My phone wasn't recording that time, so I had no proof. I tried to record again, but it didn't happen when the camera was pointed at it. I felt frustrated and uneasy. I started paying more attention to the noises in my apartment. I listened for footsteps on the floor or the sound of the couch squeaking, but I never heard anything. The cushion would simply sink at random times when I left the room. It never happened when I sat right there or when I watched from across the room. It only happened after I left. I began to think about my routine. Maybe it was something I did, but there was no pattern to it, except it happened late at night. Every time I went to the kitchen or the bathroom or my bedroom, I returned to see that seat depressed. I tried to ignore it and watch my movies as usual. I even started sitting in the center cushion sometimes, forcing myself to occupy that spot. It felt odd. The cushion had the same shape and firmness as always. I didn't feel anything strange when I sat on it. But after I got up and came back, it would still appear pressed down as if occupied. That's when my anxiety got worse. I felt nervous in my own home. I started looking over my shoulder every time I moved from one room to another. At night, when I turned off the TV, I felt a cold rush in the hallway, even if the temperature was normal. A few nights ago, I decided to spend less time in the living room. I tried watching shows on my laptop in my bedroom, but around midnight, I got bored with the smaller screen, so I returned to the living room. I told myself I wouldn't leave once I sat down. I brought enough snacks, drinks, and anything I might need so I wouldn't have to get up. I sat there for about an hour, flipping channels. My eyes kept drifting to the center cushion. Nothing happened while I was in the room, but eventually, I had to use the bathroom. I tried to hold it, but I couldn't. I got up, walked out for maybe 2 minutes, and came back. Of course, there it was again. That cushion was pressed down. I felt a rush of anger and fear. I walked right over and slapped the cushion with my hand. It popped back to its normal shape, but the spot was still warm. My head felt hot. My stomach was in knots. I said out loud, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky. I stood still, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. I walked around the coffee table, checked the windows, and turned on every light in the living room. I didn't see anything. Eventually, I turned the lights back off, sat in my recliner, and tried to focus on the TV. I couldn't. My mind kept racing. I kept glancing at the couch. I started sleeping with the bedroom door locked after that. I don't know why. It's not like a lock would stop something that can sit on my sofa without being seen. But it made me feel a little better. During the day, I tried to forget about it. I worked, talked on the phone with a friend, and went for a walk in the neighborhood. But at night, when I turned on the TV, I felt uneasy again. One evening, I invited a close friend over. I didn't tell him the full story at first. I just said, "Let's watch a movie." We sat on the sofa, talked about random stuff, drank some soda, ate some pizza. Around 11 p.m., I got up to take the empty pizza box to the kitchen. I took my time, half hoping something would happen in front of my friend. But when I got back, the cushion was normal. My friend didn't notice anything strange. I felt frustrated. I walked back to the kitchen again after a few minutes, then returned. Still, nothing. I started feeling like I was losing my mind. Eventually, my friend left, and I was alone again. The moment I was alone and left the room, I came back to see the cushion pressed down. It was as if it was mocking me. I ran my hand over it again. Warm. My heart started pounding. I felt a chill on my neck, and I stood there confused. I turned off the TV and went to bed. I couldn't stand looking at that couch anymore. Last night, I decided to confront it directly. I set up a chair across from the couch. I shut off the TV and sat in the dark, facing the sofa with only a small lamp behind me. I stayed there for at least an hour, not moving. I listened to the buzzing of the lamp, the occasional sound of a car outside, and the slight creaking of the building. Nothing happened. I got tired and annoyed. I stood up, walked out of the room, and waited in the hallway for a moment. Then I peeked in. The cushion sank a few inches. I felt my knees tremble. I gripped the wall with one hand, took a deep breath, and marched back in. My hands were shaking. I felt my pulse in my temples. I stared at the couch for a while, expecting to see it rise up or something else. It stayed sunk down. I walked over and pressed my hand into the indentation. Warm as usual. It felt like a real body's warmth. It wasn't faint or mild. It was strong, like someone had just been sitting there. I moved around the sofa. I even lifted the seat cushions, checking for a heating element or something mechanical. There was nothing. The inside of the couch was empty except for the usual foam and springs. I put everything back in place. Then I paced around the living room. My bare feet felt cold on the floor. I wanted to leave the apartment, but I also felt determined to figure it out. It was after 3 in the morning by then, and I was exhausted. Tonight, I'm here again. I'm in my recliner. The TV is on mute. I keep staring at that center cushion. My stomach is tense. My arms feel tired. My eyes sting from staying up so late all these nights. I still have no idea what's going on. The sofa looks normal if I stay in the room. It only changes when I leave. I'm not sure if I should get up and check or stay put. Part of me wants to pick up my keys and walk out the door, but this is my home. It feels wrong to leave because of some invisible presence on my couch. I stand up now, holding my empty glass. My mouth is dry. I want some water. My mind is racing, thinking about what will happen if I go to the kitchen, but I'm thirsty. I take a few steps, then glance back. The cushion is still smooth. I walk to the doorway and look over my shoulder one last time. Nothing. I step into the kitchen and fill my glass. The water tastes good, cold on my tongue. My hand is shaking a little, causing the water to slosh. I wipe a drop from my chin. My heartbeat is pounding in my ears. I walk back to the living room. My eyes go straight to the couch. The center cushion is depressed again. My chest tightens. I feel that familiar dread. I walk over and kneel down. I place my palm on the cushion, pressing it gently. It's warm. My face is hot and I feel sweat on my forehead. I swallow hard and stand up. I look around the room. It's empty. There's no one here, but it feels like someone else is with me. I'm not sure how many more nights I can put up with this. I keep imagining that someone is watching me from the sofa, even though the cushion is empty. I feel tired, but I can't bring myself to turn off the lights. I might leave the lamp on all night. For now, I'm standing here looking down at that warm indent. My body feels tense. My hands are clammy. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow night or the night after, but I do know one thing. That cushion will probably sink again the next time I walk away, and I'll still be here trying to convince myself I'm not going crazy. I still remember the day I walked into that house for the first time. I felt drained from my recent separation, and I wanted a cheap place to restart my life. The house looked plain from the outside. The walls needed fresh paint, and the lawn had patches of dead grass. Still, I felt this strange pull. It seemed like a straightforward arrangement, and I needed something fast. The owner, a woman in her late 60s, met me inside. She spoke in a low voice and acted jumpy. She pointed out the living room, a small bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a single bathroom. The floors creaked with every step, and the light switch covers looked old. Yet I wasn't bothered by these things. I wanted someplace quiet. I barely listened as she mumbled about the house's quirks. At the end of the hallway, I noticed a small door in the ceiling. It had a simple latch. The owner saw me looking and gave a quick shrug. "That's the attic," she said. She mentioned it in a flat tone, then moved on. I asked if I could see it, but she shook her head. "It's old," she said, sounding uneasy. "Don't worry about it. There's nothing up there." I felt a knot in my stomach, but I didn't push. I figured it was just storage space. I signed the paperwork, then loaded my stuff into the house. The next few days passed without major trouble. I set up my bed, put my clothes in the closet, and arranged my TV in the living room. The plumbing worked fine. The electricity flickered once or twice, but it never cut out. The first week I slept okay, but every night I noticed faint sounds above my head. It started as soft thumps. I brushed it off as the house settling or maybe a raccoon on the roof, but after a few days the noises became distinct. I heard slow steps. Something moved across the attic floor. It paced, then stopped. Then I heard a scratch, like nails on wood. My throat went dry. I tried to ignore it. I pulled the blanket over my head and listened to my own breathing. The steps came back every night around the same time. One evening, I lost my patience. I grabbed a flashlight from a kitchen drawer and checked the attic door in the hallway. It was locked. I felt around the edges, but there was no knob, only a latch mechanism. I looked at the sides of the frame for a place to stick something thin, but I couldn't force it open. I felt my heart pounding. Something was in there, and I didn't like not knowing what it was. I tried calling the owner to ask for a key. She picked up but brushed me off. She sounded rushed and told me to leave the attic alone. I asked if there were rodents or something up there. She insisted it was empty. Then she ended the call without saying goodbye. That night, I made a plan to sleep with my shoes on in case I had to jump up and investigate. I lay in bed, eyes open, waiting. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. They moved closer to the part of the attic right above my bedroom. Then they stopped. The scratching started, steady and soft. I sat up, feeling sweat on my forehead. My pulse felt heavy in my neck. I moved to the hallway, but I stood there unsure of what to do. I stared at the attic door. It stayed quiet for a moment. Then I heard a shift, like something pressing down on a loose board. The next day I searched the kitchen and living room for anything that could fit the latch on that attic door. I found a small ring of old keys in one of the drawers next to the stove. Most looked rusty or bent. One was longer and less corroded. I tried it on the latch. It clicked. I opened the attic door, lowering the narrow wooden steps. A musty smell hit my nose right away. I climbed up. I had a flashlight in one hand and a hammer in the other. The air felt stale, and dust floated in the flashlight beam. The space was small, with pitched ceilings that forced me to hunch. Cardboard boxes sat piled on top of each other. Some had old labels that had faded, others had no markings. I moved slowly, trying not to cough from the dust. My skin crawled with a sense of being watched, but the attic was silent. I opened a few boxes near the entrance. I found old clothes, letters, and random knickknacks. Then near the far corner, I saw a box with a cracked lid. Inside it, I found an old album wrapped in a torn cloth. The album was thick and heavy, with a worn cover. I flipped it open under the flashlight. The photos were black and white, some with corners that had peeled away from the pages. At first, they looked like family gatherings or something similar, but I noticed details that made my stomach tense. People stood in a circle. They wore matching robes with hoods. Their faces were mostly hidden. In one photo, a person had their hood pushed back. Their head was shaved and their eyes seemed focused on the camera. It felt unsettling, though the image was small and grainy. Another photo showed the group gathered around a table. They had some large object on it. I couldn't see it clearly. The angle was odd, and the photo had a blur along the edge. But I saw shapes that looked wrong. My hands shook. I placed the album back in the box and backed away. I decided to leave the attic. Before I went down, I heard a creak behind me. I turned with the flashlight, but nothing moved. My breath caught in my throat. I felt as if something was in the darkness, just beyond the flashlight beam. I climbed down the steps and closed the attic door, locking it with the key. My pulse wouldn't slow. I had no idea what that album meant, or who those people in the photos were. That night, I couldn't get comfortable. I kept tossing and turning. I shut off the lights and lay there, staring at the dark. The footsteps started sooner than usual, around midnight. They were heavier than before. Then I heard a low sound, almost like a whisper. I couldn't understand the words, but it felt directed at me. The hair on my arms stood up. My mouth went dry. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or some trick of the old house. But it didn't stop. The whispers turned into what sounded like chanting. It rose and fell in short bursts like repeated phrases in a strange language. I forced myself to go into the hallway again. My body felt stiff, but I raised my eyes to the attic door. The chanting stopped. Then I heard it again, but softer, almost gentle. I thought I heard my own name. It wasn't loud or clear. It sounded muffled, like someone speaking through a wall. My stomach turned and I stepped back. I locked my bedroom door and tried to drown out the noise by turning on the TV. The chanting lasted on and off until dawn. The next morning, I felt lightheaded. I had dark circles under my eyes. My hands shook as I made coffee. I walked around the house, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, in the living room, I saw a side table had shifted about 6 inches from the wall. The coasters that I kept on top lay scattered on the floor. I bent down to pick them up and noticed dusty handprints on the side of the table. They were small but defined. They led away from the table to the center of the floor and vanished. The sight made my legs tense. I looked around, half expecting to see someone. The windows were locked. The door was locked. There was no sign of forced entry. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt the need to go back into the attic. I thought maybe I had left the album out or disturbed something. When I unlocked the attic door, a chill swept over me. It wasn't from the weather. The air up there felt colder than before. I climbed the steps with my flashlight. The boxes looked the same, but the box with the album was now open on the floor. The cloth had been pulled off and the album lay open to a page I hadn't seen yet. The photo on that page showed a single figure standing in the middle of a circle of robed people. The figure pointed a finger at the camera. The shape of the hand looked contorted, the fingers long. The black and white contrast made everything more severe. I kneeled, leaning in to see if I recognized anything in the background. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a soft breeze in the attic. Then I heard that whisper again, close to my ear. My name drawn out in a raspy voice. I turned my head fast. No one was there. My flashlight steadied. I snatched the album, wrapped it, and shoved it back in the box. I felt goosebumps on my arms. My throat felt tight. I hurried down the steps, locked the attic, and jammed the key into my pocket. I paced around my living room, trying to think. I wanted to leave, but I had no plan. I didn't have the money to break the lease and move again. I also felt a strange urge to understand what was happening. I hated that feeling, but it dug into my head, making me wonder what those photos meant and why my name was being whispered. I decided to stay awake that night and see if I could catch whatever was making the sounds. I turned off every light except the small lamp near the couch. I sat there, armed with a baseball bat, staring at the hallway. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped. I felt cold air rush across my face. My eyes watered from the chill. Then I heard the attic door creak. Not opening, just making a faint noise. The chanting started again, but it sounded deeper. It came in bursts like a steady rhythm. I stood up, gripping the bat. My palms felt sweaty. My heart pounded so hard that I heard it in my ears. I walked toward the hallway, flicking on the overhead light. The chanting didn't stop. It sounded as if it was right behind the door. Then I heard my name again, clearer this time. Someone whispered it slowly. My skin felt clammy. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice cracked. The chanting paused, then resumed at a faster pace. I took another step, raising the bat. I didn't want to open the attic door, but something pushed me to confront it. I fumbled the key out of my pocket and slid it into the latch. My hand shook. I turned the key, and the latch released. I pulled down the wooden steps. The chanting cut off the instant the steps touched the floor. The attic was pitch black. My flashlight was back in the living room, but I didn't want to waste time. I climbed up with the hallway light behind me. My eyes adjusted a little. I could see the dusty boxes in the dim glow. I heard a scraping sound in the far corner. My mouth tasted bitter from fear. I raised the bat, scanning the space. Something rustled behind a stack of boxes, then went silent. My breath came in shallow bursts. I crouched to peer around the boxes. Nothing. I started to back away, but then I felt something brush my shoulder. My entire body tensed. I swung the bat blindly, hitting nothing. I lost my balance and stumbled, scraping my palm on the wooden floor. I looked behind me, panting. Empty air. The dust settled around me, illuminated by the faint light from the hallway. I forced myself to speak again, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" My words echoed. I heard a faint whisper. It was my name, repeated twice. Then came a single word that I couldn't understand, but it sounded old. It had a harsh tone, like a command. I backed toward the ladder. My eyes stung from sweat dripping down my forehead. I climbed down and closed the attic door. My chest felt tight. I locked it and went back to the living room. I stayed up the rest of the night, the bat by my side, staring at that hallway. I couldn't calm down. Every little sound in the house set my nerves on edge. The refrigerator humming, the old pipes creaking, my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. By early morning, I felt desperate. I thought about calling the owner again, but I doubted she would help. I also considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I heard chanting and found weird photos. They'd probably tell me to hire an exterminator or stop imagining things. I decided to handle it on my own. Maybe I could remove everything in the attic and toss it. I hoped that by getting rid of whatever was stored up there, the presence would lose its hold. I gathered heavy-duty trash bags and went back up once the sun was fully out. I felt less afraid in daylight. The attic smelled stale, but the tension was weaker. I rummaged through the boxes, tossing out old clothes, random papers, and broken knickknacks. I finally reached the album, I held it in my hands, noticing that my fingers were trembling. I wrapped it in a plastic bag and sealed it tight. Then I put it in another bag. I felt my pulse slow down as I did it, like I was containing something. I spent an hour clearing the rest of the attic. I found no more hidden photos or robed figures. I didn't hear any whispers. I hauled the bags outside and threw them into the trunk of my car. I drove to a nearby dumpster and tossed everything. I tried not to think about what I might be discarding. I just wanted it gone. That night, I came home and waited. Midnight passed quietly. I heard no footsteps. No scratching. The house felt still. I slept for a few hours, but woke up around 3 in the morning. The hallway was dark. I listened intently. Nothing. I exhaled, relieved. But around 4 in the morning, I heard a single whisper from the attic. It called my name once. I jumped out of bed, flipped on all the lights, and stood in the hallway. The attic door looked the same as I'd left it, but I heard this small shift of wood from above. I unlocked the door and pulled the steps down quickly. The attic was empty. No boxes, no album. The corners were dark. My flashlight caught only dust and old beams. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting for something. Nothing happened. I closed the attic and went back to bed. It's been days since that last whisper. The atmosphere still feels tense, though. Sometimes I wake up sweaty, sure I heard a scrape or a hushed voice. But I don't see anything. I check the living room and the table. Nothing is out of place. No new handprints. The house remains silent during the day. At night, I hear small creaks, but it might just be the old wood. I'm still uneasy about the things I saw in that album. I can't forget those robed figures and the odd gatherings. I think there was something trapped here, something ancient. It wanted me to find that album, to open that attic. I can't explain why. Maybe I set it free by taking those things out. I don't feel a sense of safety, but at least the constant chanting stopped. I keep the attic door locked. I plan to move out when my lease ends. For now, I live with this lingering tension. I check the hallway lights at night. I sleep with the flashlight next to my bed. I avoid thinking too hard about the voices I heard or the pressure I felt on my shoulder. I just try to go about my day. Still, I feel watched sometimes, like I'm not alone in this house. I told the owner that I cleared the attic for her. She didn't say much, she just thanked me and hung up. I can't tell if she expected me to remove that old clutter or if she's annoyed that I saw it. Either way, I don't plan on sharing details. I don't want any more involvement with whatever happened here before I moved in. Now I'm sitting here, finishing this account while the sun sets outside. The house is quiet except for the normal hum of the refrigerator and the occasional pop of the cooling ducts. I'm aware that I might hear the whisper again tonight. If I do, I'm not going back up there. I've done enough. I'll stay in bed, keep the lights on, and wait for morning. I'm hoping that whatever force was there has lost its hold. My gut tells me that it's still around, but weaker. I think it's testing me, seeing if I'll break or investigate further. I have no interest in that. My only focus now is getting through each day until I can afford to move somewhere else. In the meantime, I keep a small hope that my nights will stay quiet and my name will remain unspoken in the dark. I'm telling this straight. I was alone in that hotel bathroom in the middle of the night, and I heard knocking from behind the mirror. There's nothing there but pipes and concrete. That sound froze me. It was steady, like knuckles tapping twice on a hollow surface. I flung the bathroom door open, half expecting someone to be messing around, but the room was empty. My heart was going nuts in my chest. This wasn't normal. It felt too real to ignore. And that's just the start of everything that went wrong that week. My name is Daniel. I travel a lot for work. Consulting, meetings, site visits. Most of the time, hotels feel the same. You check in, you drop your bags, you shower off the plane ride or the drive, and you try to relax enough to get some sleep. I'm used to the random noises you get in hotels. Sometimes you hear a neighbor's TV or people talking in the hallway. I'm also used to older pipes making weird creaks. But that night I had never heard such a distinct, intentional sound. Knock knock, almost polite, as if someone was asking to come in. I had checked into this place around midnight. My flight got delayed, and by the time I got my rental car, I just wanted to crash. The front desk guy was polite but tired. There was a dull hum of lights in the lobby, and no other guests around. After I got my key, I headed up to the room, threw my luggage on the floor, and went straight for a hot shower. I was exhausted. The bathroom was small with a standard sink, a decent mirror, and a tub behind a shower curtain. The door had a simple lock. I turned the water on, waited until it got hot, and then locked the bathroom door from the inside. It was a habit, something I always do in hotel bathrooms for privacy. The walls were white, and I could see a little rust around the metal fixtures. Steam fogged up the mirror in seconds. I felt my body relax under the water. I was rinsing shampoo out of my hair when I heard it. At first, I thought it was some random pipe noise, but it was too deliberate. Tock tock. 2 quick knocks. I stood there with water running down my face. I turned off the shower. My ears strained for any follow-up. I glanced around. The shower curtain swayed a bit from the shift in air, but nothing else seemed strange. I opened the curtain just enough to see if anyone was messing with the bathroom door. The handle wasn't moving. The door was still locked. My heart pounded, but I tried to stay calm. I figured maybe it came from the next room. Hotels have thin walls, so maybe it was a neighbor. I turned the water back on. After a few seconds, I heard it again. Tock tock. It was against the wall with the mirror. I shut off the water for the second time, then listened so hard I could feel pressure in my ears. The steam in the bathroom felt suffocating. I stepped out of the tub, water dripping everywhere. I grabbed a towel, but I didn't even try to dry myself off. I just stood there staring at the mirror. There was nothing behind me. The reflection was just me, the tiled walls, and the soft glow of the single light fixture above the sink. No movement, no shadows. My chest felt tight, and I reached for the bathroom door lock. I flipped it open quickly. I yanked the door open and looked out into the main part of the room. The bed was unmade, the TV off, my suitcase on the floor. There was no sign that anyone had entered. I stepped into the room, dripping water, leaving footprints on the carpet. It was silent. I checked the hallway outside. Empty. No one in sight. I admit I felt a little silly and spooked. I dried off, threw on a pair of boxers, and sat on the edge of the bed. I listened for any random noises, but the place was quiet. I got back up and walked around the room. I felt the walls, knocked on them with my knuckles. It all sounded solid, nothing hollow or suspicious. Part of me wanted to blame old plumbing or something like that, so I decided to just shrug it off. I turned on the TV, found some random late-night talk show, and let it play in the background. I stayed awake for another hour, hoping I'd just pass out from exhaustion. Eventually, I fell asleep. Nothing else happened that night. But the next day, I woke up feeling off. The memory of that knocking kept popping into my head while I got ready for my morning meeting. I showered again, but left the bathroom door unlocked. No strange sounds. I checked out the bathroom mirror more closely before I left the room. It looked normal, just an average mirror with a frame. I tapped on the wall behind it, which was now cold to the touch. It sounded solid. I didn't figure out anything unusual. That day, I tried to focus on my work obligations. Meetings, coffee, more meetings, documents to sign. I pushed the memory of the knocking out of my mind, but as the evening rolled around, I started feeling uneasy. I realized I was nervous about going back to that room. Normally, after a long day, I'd look forward to a soft bed and a hot shower, but I couldn't relax this time. I grabbed a quick dinner at a nearby place and made sure to stay out a bit later than usual. I wanted to go back when I was really tired, hoping I'd just crash without obsessing over weird noises. Around 11, I stepped into the lobby. The same front desk guy was there, and he gave me a small nod. I considered telling him about the knocking, but decided to wait. Maybe it was a one-time fluke. I took the elevator up, walked into my room, and turned on every light. It felt safer that way. I locked the main door, set the chain latch, then flipped on the TV. I thought about taking another shower but felt uneasy about locking myself in the bathroom again. I decided to brush my teeth and skip the shower. My plan was to just go to bed and get some sleep. At about 2 in the morning, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The TV was still on with the volume very low. My heart was racing, so I listened carefully. At first, I heard nothing but the faint TV chatter. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down. Then I heard a gentle tapping. It was the same sound. 2 knocks coming from the bathroom. I sat up so fast I felt a twinge in my lower back. My palms got sweaty. I stared at the closed bathroom door, which was slightly ajar since I hadn't locked it. The light was off in there. I could only see part of the sink. I waited. My throat was dry. I got out of bed quietly and walked closer to the bathroom door. I reached for the light switch, my hand shaking. I flicked it on. The bathroom lit up, looking the same as always. The mirror reflected the sink and the empty shower. The door was open, so there wasn't anyone inside. I stepped forward, listened to the wall. No more knocking. I stood there for a minute, my mind racing. Then I grabbed my phone and decided to ask for a room change. I wasn't going to spend another night hearing weird knocks at 2 in the morning. I called the front desk. A groggy voice answered. I explained that I was hearing sounds behind the bathroom wall and was feeling uncomfortable. The clerk told me the hotel was almost full, but he could arrange something. I said I didn't care if it was a smaller room or if I had to pay extra. I just wanted out of that room. He told me to come downstairs, so I put on jeans and a t-shirt, gathered my stuff as fast as I could, and went down. I spoke with the front desk guy. He looked like he wanted to ask me questions, but he just nodded and mumbled that he would switch me to another room. He said something like, "We get occasional noise complaints. Could be the plumbing. I don't know." I didn't push it. I was relieved just to get another room. The second room was on a different floor. It looked more or less the same. 1 queen bed, a small desk, an identical bathroom layout. I was too worn out to care. I thanked the clerk, went upstairs and set my stuff down. I felt safer knowing that maybe I'd left that weird noise behind. The rest of that night I slept better. No knocks, no odd sounds. The next day was busy again with work. I left early for meetings and got back around dinner time. I had a burger from the place next door and tried to push away the memory of the previous nights. But in the back of my mind, I still felt uneasy. I kept glancing at the bathroom door. My shoulders were tight and I couldn't relax. Around midnight, I finally decided to take a shower. I told myself it was a different room, so there was nothing to worry about. I closed the bathroom door but didn't lock it. I turned on the water and felt the hot steam envelop me. I shampooed my hair, rinsed, and started to feel calmer. Then I glanced at the bathroom mirror from inside the shower. The reflection was blurry from the steam, but I could see my silhouette. I thought about the knocks. My heart rate picked up and I tried to ignore it. I got out of the shower and toweled off. I stood at the sink, brushing my teeth. The mirror was fogged up, so I couldn't see my face clearly. Then I felt something like a vibration on the floor under my feet. I stopped brushing and listened. I heard a faint tap, like someone was knocking on a pipe that ran through the wall. It was so soft that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I spat out the toothpaste and leaned closer to the wall. I wiped the mirror with my hand to see if there was any movement behind me. Nothing. But then I heard it, clear as day. 2 knocks. It sounded exactly like the first room. Tock, tock. My stomach did a flip. I felt my skin go cold and my hair stood on end. My breathing got shallow. The difference this time was that it was softer, as if coming from deeper inside the wall. But it was the same pattern. I panicked. I spun around, yanked open the bathroom door, and rushed into the bedroom area. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. For a second I stood there in the middle of the room, dripping onto the carpet, wearing just a towel. I clenched my teeth, trying to decide what to do. It was late. I didn't want to call the front desk again and sound like a crazy person, but I also couldn't ignore it. My mind raced with different explanations: plumbing issues, old building, random noises. But it was too specific. It sounded like a knock, as if someone was behind the mirror, tapping to get attention. After a few minutes of pacing, I put on some clothes. I opened the bathroom door all the way. The light was still on and the mirror was still foggy. I waited, standing by the doorway, staring at the wall. My heart felt like it was in my throat. Nothing happened. The silence was heavy. I kept waiting. Eventually, I got tired of standing there, so I slowly backed out of the bathroom and went to sit on the bed. It was probably around 2:30 or 3 a.m. at that point. I felt wide awake. I was breathing too fast. I decided to watch some dumb show on my laptop to distract myself. I turned the volume up just enough to keep my mind off that echo in the back of my head. I sat there in bed, eyes flicking toward the bathroom every few minutes. I couldn't help it. My thoughts felt scrambled. I kept repeating to myself, "It's just pipes. It's just an old building." I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, my alarm was going off. It was 7 a.m., and I was supposed to meet a colleague for coffee. I dragged myself to my feet. I felt tired, anxious, and annoyed. I hopped in the shower quickly, got dressed, and forced myself to pretend nothing was wrong. All day, I kept thinking about that noise. During lunch, I decided to say something to the front desk on my way back in the evening. Maybe they would tell me if there was a known plumbing issue or some weird quirk with the building. So, after my last meeting, I stopped by the lobby. A different staff member was at the desk, a younger guy who was scrolling through his phone. I asked him if there were any known issues with the walls or plumbing. He gave me an odd look, like he knew something. Then he tried to brush it off. He said, "We sometimes get complaints about strange noises. I'm not sure what causes them. The building's old." He wouldn't make eye contact. He looked embarrassed. I pressed him a bit, asking if it was something serious. He shrugged and said, "It's not harmful or anything, it's just weird. Some people hear tapping at night." That made my stomach drop. He was basically confirming everything that happened to me. I thanked him and went upstairs, feeling creeped out. I spent that final night in the same second room. I heard the knocking again around the same hour, around 2 a.m. It was quiet, but it was there. Tock tock, from behind the bathroom mirror. I didn't even get up this time. I just lay in bed, clutching the sheets. My heart was hammering and I felt sweat beading on my forehead. I stared at the bathroom door, and I could feel my throat tighten. I kept expecting to hear footsteps or see the knob turn, but it never happened. Just the same rhythmic taps repeating every few minutes. I can't explain it. I don't know if it was a pipe issue, a structural problem, or something else. All I know is that it didn't feel random. It sounded too deliberate, too intentional. The rest of that night, I barely slept. I bolted out of the hotel first thing in the morning, checked out, and drove to the airport. I didn't say anything more to the staff. I just wanted to leave. Even now, whenever I think about that trip, I feel tense. I remember the sound of those knocks, how precise they were, and how they happened in 2 different rooms at the same time of night. Other people have heard them too, so I know it wasn't in my head. I still travel for work, but I haven't gone back to that hotel. I don't plan to. If anyone ever asks for hotel recommendations in that city, I just shake my head and tell them to look somewhere else. I'm done with those walls, and I'm done with whatever is hidden behind the mirror. I got home late that night and felt a strange chill the moment I turned my key in the front door. I hadn't had any drinks, and I wasn't coming from a place that would make me jumpy. I was just tired and wanted to take a quick shower before bed. But the instant the door clicked shut behind me, I heard a faint meow. It sounded like it was coming from outside, near the small window that leads to my basement. I froze, right there in the entryway, and listened again. Another meow, muffled but distinct. It wasn't the kind of stray cat sound you hear off in the distance. It was closer, almost like there was a cat right under my feet. My house is old, and the basement isn't very large. There's a tiny window at ground level that I usually keep closed. I like to keep it shut to prevent mice or insects from wandering in. When I realized the sound was near the basement, I walked over to my living room window, which looks out on the side of the house where the basement window is. I turned on the outside light, hoping to see if there was a cat lurking around, but I didn't see anything. The night was quiet, and the light revealed nothing but the edge of the lawn and a patch of bare dirt near that small basement opening. I went downstairs to check. The basement has a wooden door that creaks when I open it. The steps are narrow and I always have to duck my head to avoid hitting the low ceiling at the bottom. I flipped on the single light bulb that hangs from the ceiling. It's always dim, but it's enough to see the corners of the basement. Nothing looked out of place at first. My old boxes were stacked against one wall and my laundry stuff was in the corner. But then I noticed something on the floor, right by the far wall. There were wet footprints, but they weren't shaped like shoes or boots. They looked like small tracks with a kind of rough outline, as if a cat or a small animal had walked through mud and then padded around on my cement floor. I looked toward the wall where the footprints led. There was no door there, no window, no hole that I knew of. But the footprints stopped right at the bricks. I felt a tightening in my stomach, like I was seeing something I couldn't explain. I double-checked the corners, thinking maybe the cat was crouched somewhere, but I saw no sign of any living thing. The tracks looked fresh, though, not dried out. The mud was still moist. I knelt down and touched one of the prints with my finger. It left a smear of brown on my skin. I wiped it off on my jeans and stood up. I called out, "Here, kitty," in a low voice, feeling a little silly. No response. The only sound was the hum of the old furnace. I stepped closer to the wall where the tracks ended. I ran my hand over the bricks, checking for any cracks or loose pieces, but the wall felt solid. There was no gap or hidden opening. I stood there for a moment, feeling my heart thump a little harder than usual. Then I heard a faint scratching sound. It came from somewhere behind me toward the stairs. I spun around, expecting to see a cat darting away, but I only saw the stairwell, the partially open door at the top, and the bare light bulb overhead. The scratching sound stopped as soon as I turned. The basement felt too still, and I could hear my own breathing. I didn't see any movement, and after another minute of walking in circles, I decided I had probably imagined the scratch. Maybe it was the old pipes. I turned off the light, climbed back up, and shut the basement door. The rest of the night, I tried to tell myself it was just a stray cat that wandered in somehow, left a few prints, and found a way out. But part of me wondered how it got out if no windows or doors were open. I thought maybe I left the basement window cracked open. Sometimes the latch is loose and it doesn't close all the way. I made a note to check it in the morning. That night, I slept poorly. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up thirsty. I sat up in bed, rubbed my eyes, and reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. As I did, I noticed a pair of tiny glowing spots on the other side of the room, near the bedroom door. They looked like reflection points, similar to how a cat's eyes glow when light hits them in the dark. But I had no lights on other than the faint glow from the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains. I leaned forward. The spots just hovered there at about the height of a cat sitting upright. My pulse jumped and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. But when I hit the screen, the light shone across the room and there was nothing there. My heart was pounding and my mouth felt dry, so I chugged the water. I got up, checked around the bedroom, under the bed, even in the hallway. Everything was empty. I told myself maybe it was just the street lamp reflecting off something metallic. But I didn't have anything on that side of the room that would reflect like that. Still, I tried not to get carried away. I was tired, half asleep, and probably saw a trick of the light. The next day, I went down to the basement first thing in the morning. I brought a flashlight to inspect the wall more closely. The footprints were still there, dried now, but no new ones had appeared. The window was closed tight, and the latch was secure. I pushed on it to test if it might have an opening. It was sealed shut. The idea that a cat had gotten in was still possible if it snuck in while I was carrying groceries or something. but I usually don't leave the door open long enough for a cat to sneak by without me noticing. I spent the afternoon working from home. At around 5 o'clock, I heard a soft thump from down in the basement. It sounded like something falling. I put my phone aside and rushed downstairs. The basement was quiet. I checked behind the furnace, I checked between the boxes, I even looked under the rickety old table I use for storage. I found a small box that had been on top of another box but was now on the floor. That might have explained the thump. I picked it up and saw 3 muddy paw prints on the side of the box. They were the same shape I saw on the floor the night before. I suddenly felt uneasy again. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. I placed the box back on the shelf and looked around for more prints. I saw 2 partial paw marks on the floor, leading away from the box, heading toward that same wall. No cat in sight, no open window, no open door. I moved slowly to the wall and tapped it with my knuckles. It sounded solid, but I couldn't help checking for some hidden latch or seam. I pressed each brick with my hand, searching for a loose one. I found nothing. I stood back and took a deep breath. My nerves felt on edge and my stomach was tense. My hands were trembling a little. That evening, I decided to set up a simple trap. I didn't want to hurt the cat. I just wanted to see if it was actually there. I placed an old cardboard box in the basement with some leftover tuna in a small dish. Then I set up my phone to record, propping it on a stack of books aimed toward the box. I made sure the angle covered the area near the suspicious wall. I turned off the basement light and went upstairs. A few hours later, well after dark, I crept down the stairs to check on my trap. I grabbed my phone and stopped the recording. Then I played it back while standing in the basement. At first, it was just darkness on the screen and about 20 minutes of nothing happening. Then, around the 30-minute mark, I heard a faint scratching sound. The phone picked up the noise, but the screen was almost pitch black. I saw a small flicker of movement near the box, but it was too dark to make out a shape. It could have been a shadow or a small reflection. Then the scratching noise stopped. A minute later, there was a low hiss. It sounded like a cat's hiss, but I couldn't see anything. I fast-forwarded a bit, and near the 40-minute mark, 2 small points of light appeared on the screen, right next to the box. They looked exactly like cat eyes catching a bit of reflection, but the rest of the figure was invisible in the darkness. The eyes moved closer to the box, hovered there for a moment, and then turned. In that moment, they moved toward the left side of the frame, which was the direction of that solid wall. The eyes got closer to the camera, and for a split second, it looked like something passed directly in front of my phone, blocking the lens. Then, total darkness again. The eyes vanished. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling a jolt of fear race through my body. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk over to the spot where I had placed the box of tuna. The dish was empty. The basement smelled faintly like fish, and I could see new paw prints around the box. Some of the paw prints led toward the wall. I moved the box aside, knelt down, and shined my phone's flashlight along the floor. The prints ended at the brick wall again, exactly where I saw them before. My mind raced. I felt sweaty and my muscles were tense. My stomach felt like it had a knot in it. I ran my hand across the wall, pressing harder this time, trying every brick one by one. Nothing budged. I took a step back and tried to calm myself. My breath came in quick bursts, and my palms were damp. I reminded myself this could still be a real cat. Maybe there was a tiny hole or crack I couldn't see. Maybe the cat was crawling through an opening behind a vent or pipe. But the odd thing was how the eyes seemed to appear and disappear without any explanation. I started to wonder if I was missing something obvious, like a hidden crawl space. My house is old, so maybe there's a sealed-off area that the previous owner forgot to mention. That night, I decided to look at any old plans of the property if I could find them online. I left the basement and locked the door, more out of habit than real security. I wasn't sure what I was expecting a cat to do, but I felt better locking it. I went to my living room and opened my laptop. I was restless, tapping my foot as I searched for any records or blueprints of the house. I found some basic info on a local real estate site. but nothing detailed. It listed the square footage and general features, but no mention of secret rooms or hidden passages. I tried to go to bed. I lay there in the dark, thinking I might see those glowing eyes appear again. My skin felt prickly, and every small noise in the house made me tense up. The refrigerator clicked on, and I nearly jumped. I stared at the ceiling, counting the hours. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to my alarm at 7 in the morning with a tight feeling in my chest. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. I would hear small noises in the basement at odd times. Sometimes it was scratching, sometimes it was a soft thump like something was being knocked over. I'd go down to check, but I never saw the cat itself. I tried to find more prints, but after that night with the video, the prints stopped appearing. The dish of tuna remained untouched whenever I tried to bait it again. Then, a few days later, I experienced something around 3 in the morning. I was lying in bed, half awake, when I heard that same meow. It was close, like it was coming from right outside my bedroom door. I felt a jolt of panic, and my heart thumped hard. I sat up, turned on the lamp, and stared at the door. I noticed a shadow under the door, like something was blocking the light from the hallway. My skin crawled with goosebumps. I slid out of bed, reached for a small flashlight on my nightstand, and walked to the door. I felt a chill on my arms. I paused, hand on the doorknob, feeling my heart pounding. Then I twisted the knob and yanked the door open. There was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the lights off, no sign of a cat or any other creature. I felt my back go tense. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, but I saw nothing. At this point, my nerves were shot. I was exhausted from interrupted sleep, and my mind felt like it was constantly on alert. I spent more time investigating the basement wall, pushing aside every box, checking every inch of the floor, the corners, the ceiling. I searched for vents, cracks, anything. I found no explanation. The footprints that did appear led to nowhere. The eyes I caught on video vanished as soon as light touched them. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I still see 2 glowing points in the darkness, watching me from a corner of the room. They stay there for a few seconds, and then they vanish the second I try to shine a light on them. I hear the occasional hiss or meow. It's never loud. It's always faint, like it's far away or muffled. But it never sounds like it's coming from outside. It's always inside, almost underfoot or just around the corner. I've considered calling an exterminator or a local animal control unit, but I'm embarrassed to admit what's happening. I can't just say, "There's a cat in my house, but it walks through walls and vanishes when I turn on the lights." That sounds ridiculous. I still believe there might be a rational explanation. Maybe it's a stray that's incredibly good at hiding. Maybe I'm hearing echoes of a cat outside and imagining the rest. But I keep going back to those muddy paw prints. There's physical evidence. I saw them with my own eyes, and they ended at a solid brick wall. I know I'm not making that up. So now every night I come home a bit on edge. I check the basement, I check the windows, I lock the doors. I sleep with a flashlight next to me. Some nights are quiet, and I almost start to think the problem went away. Other nights I hear that faint meow again, or I see those 2 glowing points in the corner of my vision, and I feel my heart skip a beat. I still don't know how the cat is getting in or out, or why it never shows itself in full light, but I know it's there. I feel it watching me sometimes, and I see those muddy prints that seem to appear and disappear without any explanation. I'm not sure what else to do. I can't block a wall. I can't seal something that has no door or window. The basement remains the same. I've tried rearranging boxes, hoping to uncover a hidden space, but the only thing I've accomplished is making the basement look more cluttered. I can't find any damage to the foundation. I've checked the outside of the house too. Nothing suggests an animal has been tunneling in or prying anything loose. For now, I live with it. I try not to think about it too much. But when I hear a quiet meow at 1 in the morning, or see a flash of those reflective eyes in the hall, I feel that surge of fear. My chest tightens and my legs feel a bit weak. I grip my flashlight, but I know that as soon as the light hits the spot, it'll be gone. There's no sign of the cat. There's no sign of any intruder. Yet the paw prints show up. leading to the wall with no exit. That's how things stand. I can't explain it. If it's a real cat, I can't figure out its path. If it's something else, I don't want to think about that. All I know is that it's there, and I see it sometimes. And if you ever come to my house late at night, maybe you'll hear it too. Maybe you'll hear that faint meow near the basement window, or catch a glimpse of two bright eyes staring at you in the dark. And if you do, don't bother turning on your flashlight. By the time the beam hits that spot, it'll be gone, like it was never there at all. I walked into the lobby of my office building this morning, feeling a slight ache in my lower back and thinking about how many emails I had waiting. The security guard at the front desk gave me a quick nod. I tapped my work badge against the reader, heard the beep, and stepped toward the elevators. The doors to the middle elevator opened with a metallic scrape. I stepped inside and faced the mirrored walls, as I always do. But lately, those mirrors have made my mornings feel strange. 3 weeks ago, I noticed something I couldn't explain. I pressed the button for the 9th floor and glanced at my reflection, just a casual check of my tie. My reflection moved a second after I did. At first, I thought it was my own groggy eyes. Maybe I was tired, or maybe there was a slight glitch in the lighting, but it kept happening. I'd shift my weight from one foot to the other, and in the mirror, my reflection would do it just a little bit later. It was subtle. If I blinked, I might have missed it. But once I caught that first delay, I couldn't stop watching it every time I rode that elevator. I didn't tell anyone because I figured they would think I was being ridiculous. I'm just a normal guy who does IT work for a company on the 9th floor of a tall commercial building. My days are filled with software tickets and phone calls. I troubleshoot login errors and set up new machines for new hires. I grab coffee when I can. That's the routine. But the elevator was messing with my head. I tried ignoring it for a while. I'd step in, face the doors, and look at my phone instead. Sometimes I'd pretend I was responding to a text just to avoid seeing my reflection do anything odd. But it got worse a few days later. It was a Tuesday around 8:45 a.m. I was alone in the elevator, riding up, and I decided to look at the mirror for a second. As soon as I raised my arm to scratch my face, I saw my reflection do the same motion a fraction of a second later. It was like a small lag in a video call. My reflection's face looked just like mine. Nothing else was off. But that delay made my scalp prickle. My arms felt cold. I glanced around the elevator looking for hidden cameras or anything that could cause some visual trick. There was nothing except the standard fluorescent lighting overhead. The black floor had a few scuff marks. The corners were a bit dusty, but nothing else stood out. I tried to brush it off again. I went into work, sat at my desk, and buried myself in tasks. I tried not to think about the elevator all day, but it stayed in the back of my mind. Every time I got up to refill my water bottle or head to the restroom, I'd think about the mirror. That night, when I was ready to leave, I considered taking the stairs, but I didn't. Instead, I rode the elevator down with 2 other people. I noticed that I didn't see any delay with their reflections when we stood side by side. I looked at them through the mirror, and they seemed in sync. They got off at the lobby, and I walked out behind them, trying not to look too uneasy. Over the next few days, I tested things. I'd ride the elevator alone whenever I could. If someone else stepped in, I'd wait for the next one. I wanted to see if this reflection lag was real or if I was imagining it. Each time it happened only with me. I'd scratch my head, and the reflection would be late. I'd shift my briefcase from my left hand to my right, and my reflection would do it just a split second later. It was almost impossible to time perfectly, but it was consistent enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. That was the part that made my heart pound. Last Thursday, I tried taking a video with my phone. I propped my phone at chest level, turned on the camera, and aimed it at the mirror while I moved my other hand. But the recorded video showed everything in perfect sync. There was no delay in the footage. Watching the playback, I felt my palms sweat. I replayed it 10 times. Each time I saw normal movement, no lag, no weirdness. But watching it live, with my own eyes, I saw a delay. I double-checked the elevator's brand name, but it was just a standard manufacturer. Nothing special. No brand I'd never heard of. On Monday of this week, the entire thing took a turn I wasn't ready for. I stepped into the elevator around 9:01 a.m., which is a bit later than usual because I had an early off-site meeting. The elevator felt stuffy, like the air wasn't circulating well. I pressed 9 and faced the mirror, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity. I don't know why I looked into that mirror again, but I did. I stood there, breathing a bit faster than normal. The overhead lights buzzed quietly and the elevator started moving up. I watched my own face for a moment, noticing the lines around my eyes, the slight stubble on my chin. I blinked, or at least I thought I blinked. Then I realized my reflection seemed to blink before I did. It was a small detail, just a split second, but it was the opposite of the lag I'd been seeing. Instead of being late, it was early. I backed up against the wall of the elevator, staring straight at my reflection, feeling my chest tighten. My reflection blinked again. I felt my eyes widen in real time. Then I blinked a moment later. My mouth went dry. I held my breath and lifted my hand to touch my face, but my reflection moved too soon. It was like it was anticipating my action. My breath felt shallow. The hair on my arms stood up. I couldn't understand what I was seeing, and I felt a burst of panic that made my stomach clench. When the doors opened on my floor, I almost fell out of the elevator. My legs felt shaky, like I had just sprinted up a flight of stairs. I mumbled something like, "What the hell?" under my breath. I stood in the hallway, watching the doors close. Then I hurried over to my office door and let myself in. My heart was hammering so hard that I wondered if my coworkers would notice. But no one did. They were all focused on their computers. I dropped into my chair and tried to get my breathing under control. For the rest of that day, I avoided the elevator. If I needed a break, I took the stairs. If I wanted lunch, I stayed in. I pretended I was too busy to go out. I was still shaky hours later. My lower back was stiff and my shoulders felt tight from all the tension. Around 6 p.m., I realized I had to face the elevator to leave. I decided to just do it and hope someone else would be inside with me. When I walked to the lobby area on my floor, there was nobody around. Everyone had already gone home. The hallways were quiet, and the vending machine hum was the only sound. I pressed the button and waited. My mind kept replaying that morning's incident. The reflection blinked first. It was so bizarre. The elevator arrived with a ding. I stepped in carefully. The mirrors were there, reflecting the overhead light. I kept my eyes down, refusing to look at my own face. I pressed the button for the lobby and waited. The elevator started moving, and I felt my heart thumping again. After a few seconds, I couldn't help myself. I glanced up at my reflection. It looked normal. My reflection stared back at me, no delay, no early movement. It matched me exactly. I held my breath, waiting for something strange. But this time, it stayed in sync. I felt a slight sense of relief when the doors opened on the ground floor. I walked out, trying not to look like I was about to lose it. The security guard gave me another nod, and I nodded back. Outside, the air felt cool on my face, and I took a deep breath. I tried to tell myself it was a one-time thing or some trick of the light, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, I woke up with the same tense feeling in my chest. I kept thinking about calling in sick, but I had too many responsibilities at work. I arrived at the building around 8:30 a.m., still feeling uneasy. The same security guard was at the front desk. I didn't want to seem suspicious, so I forced a small smile. Then I walked toward the elevator bank. This time I spotted a coworker waiting. I was relieved. Maybe if someone else was in there with me, I wouldn't pay attention to the mirror. So I rode the elevator with him. He made small talk about a project deadline, and I tried to act normal. I resisted the urge to stare at the mirror. We reached the 9th floor, and I stepped out quickly. Around lunchtime, I realized I had a meeting scheduled on the 10th floor. That meant either walking one floor up the stairs or taking the elevator. The stairs seemed easier, so I walked up. No problem there. I came back down the same way. That day, I managed to avoid the mirrored elevator almost entirely, but I knew that sooner or later I'd have to face it alone again. The real trouble started yesterday. I stayed late to finish a system upgrade. By the time I shut down my computer, it was almost 8 p.m. The place was practically empty. The corridors were dim. When I reached the elevators, I thought about taking the stairs, but going down 9 flights that late at night didn't sound fun. I was tired, and my bag felt heavy on my shoulder. So I hit the button and waited alone. The elevator arrived with that same metallic sound. The doors slid open. I stepped inside, telling myself not to look at the mirrors. But as soon as the doors closed, I felt that pull. I turned my head. My reflection was there, showing me with my bag on my left shoulder, my tie slightly loosened, my sleeves rolled up. Everything looked normal. I tried to keep my gaze down, but the reflection caught my eye. I felt a jolt of adrenaline, like a mild electric shock. Then the elevator started moving. I stood there, feeling my pulse in my neck. I wanted to keep my eyes on the floor numbers above the door, but I couldn't. I glanced sideways again and saw my reflection just staring back. I could have sworn I saw a tiny smirk, almost invisible, but my own face felt tense, not smiling at all. I jerked my head away, focusing on the digital floor display. 8, 7, 6. My heart was beating faster. I told myself it was my imagination. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was my reflection raising a hand toward its face, while my actual hand stayed at my side. The reflection's fingers touched its cheek, slowly, then lowered again. My real hand never moved. My body went rigid. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt closed. The elevator reached the lobby level. The doors slid open. I stumbled out, letting out a shaky exhale. The security guard wasn't there. Maybe he was on a break. The lobby was empty and quiet. I gripped my bag so hard my knuckles hurt. I walked out onto the street, forcing myself to breathe normally. My heart was hammering and my legs felt weak. I had trouble focusing on my surroundings. There was a sour taste in my mouth that I couldn't shake. I barely slept last night. I kept picturing the reflection raising its hand on its own. Today, I tried to come in late again, hoping to see more people around when I arrived. I grabbed a coffee at a nearby cafe, took an extra 15 minutes to stand outside, and finally walked into the building around 9:30. The security guard gave me his usual nod, and I walked straight to the elevators. Before I could push the button, a group of 3 people from another company joined me. I felt relieved. We all got in together. I kept my eyes on the floor, half listening to their conversation about some client meeting. We rode up, and they got off at the 7th floor. Only 2 more floors for me, so I focused on my phone until I reached 9. Now, I'm in my office, sitting at my desk. It's mid-afternoon. My phone keeps buzzing with more tickets to handle, but I haven't been able to concentrate. I keep thinking about that delayed movement, and then the faster blink, and then the reflection moving on its own. My hands are shaking as I type this up in a blank document. There's a dryness in my throat, and I feel a tension headache starting behind my eyes. I don't know if I'm losing it or if there's something really wrong with that elevator. But every time I think about facing those mirrors alone, my chest tightens and my stomach churns. I have to leave soon. I keep glancing at the clock, hoping someone will work late with me so I'm not alone in that elevator. If not, I might take the stairs, no matter how long it takes. At this point, I'll do anything to avoid seeing that reflection act on its own again. I can't handle the idea of my reflection blinking first or raising its hand while I stand still. It feels too real. I might tell the security guard. I might tell someone at building management about the mirrors, but I don't even know what to say. Hey, my reflection in the elevator seems to have a mind of its own. That's not going to sound sane, but something's going on, and I can't pretend it's normal anymore. I'm heading out in about half an hour. My plan is to wait by the elevator bank until someone else shows up. If nobody does, I'll take the stairs. 9 flights isn't so bad. especially with the way my heart is pumping right now. I can't stop replaying that moment when the reflection touched its cheek while I just stood there. My skin tingles just thinking about it. It's not a simple delay or a trick of the light. It's doing things that I'm not doing. That's everything so far. I'm still at my desk trying to look busy, but I'm really just counting the minutes. I keep rubbing my temples trying to ease this headache, but it won't go away. If I manage to get home without another incident, I'll try to sleep tonight. But I know I'll be on edge all day tomorrow and every day after that. I'm not sure how long I can deal with this. Every time I pass those mirrors, my palms sweat, and I feel lightheaded. It's like the elevator has become an obstacle I can't face without a knot forming in my gut. For now, I'm just sitting here, waiting. I can hear someone in the next cubicle talking about weekend plans. I can hear the hum of the air conditioner. My throat is dry, and my fingers keep shaking. This is all so strange, and I have no explanation. But I can't ignore it anymore. That reflection in the elevator isn't just a reflection. It's acting differently, and I'm not sure what it wants. Maybe I'll figure it out if I have the courage to look at it again. But right now, all I feel is dread. I'm hoping I can get out of here without seeing it move on its own again. That's all I can do. I stand at the iron gate every evening and secure it with 2 heavy chains. I snap both padlocks shut. I test them by pulling, shaking, and leaning my weight against the bars. It always feels solid. Nothing rattles. There's no gap that I can slip a finger through. I do this carefully because I've heard the stories. Other volunteers told me this place has a habit of letting itself out at night. They said no matter what they do, the gate stands open in the morning. That sounded ridiculous when I first heard it, but I've seen it too many times now. This cemetery has something strange going on. I won't pretend I understand it. I only know I've stood in front of that gate in the morning and found it wide open, even though the chains and the locks look exactly the same as I left them. I volunteer at this historical cemetery because I care about preserving old places. I'm not a professional caretaker. I have a day job somewhere else. I come here in the evenings to sweep leaves off the walkways, scrub away the moss that creeps onto old headstones, and keep an eye out for any vandalism. It sounds simple, and for the most part, it is. But this gate problem has become my main concern. On my first night here, I did my usual check of the grounds. The place is quiet most of the time. You hear the occasional car on the road outside. Sometimes you hear an owl or the rustle of small animals in the trees that ring the cemetery. There are old stones and statues around, but they're all in decent shape. The caretaker before me did a good job, and the other volunteers keep things tidy as well. I thought I'd walk the perimeter, check the fence line, and lock up. That night I recall how the lock clicked into place. It was a brand new padlock I brought from home. I used 2 chains, one around the middle of the gates and another near the bottom. I even made sure to thread them in such a way that you couldn't lift the gate or wiggle it sideways. Then I left for the night, feeling a bit smug about how secure it was. When I arrived the next morning, the gate was sitting wide open. The chains hung on each side of the bars like they'd been neatly undone. The locks were still fastened, but the entire setup was on the wrong side of the fence. It looked as though someone had lifted them off, opened the gate, and then placed them back in a casual way. Yet there was no scratch, no mark, and no sign of force. I felt my heartbeat pick up. My face got hot. I remember standing there, turning the padlocks in my hands. They were locked. I had to use my own keys to open them again. There was no sign they'd been tampered with. I asked around. A couple of the other volunteers shrugged and said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." I asked them if they knew how. They said they'd tried everything. They'd even replaced the locks, replaced the chains, and checked for any hidden openings in the fence or the gate. No one ever found anything. One volunteer said he tried sleeping in his car outside the cemetery to catch whoever did it, but he fell asleep eventually and woke to the gate open. That made my neck prickle. It felt like a challenge, so I decided to find a way to keep it locked and see who might be sneaking in. The next night I arrived just before the sunset. The air was heavy and muggy. The forecast said there might be rain later, so I wore a light jacket. I did a quick walkthrough. The grass was damp with evening dew. The statues and monuments cast long shadows across the paths. I could smell wet leaves and old stone. A breeze moved through the tall pines around the edges. It made an odd hissing sound as it passed. I didn't see any people. I didn't hear any voices. It was just me and the cemetery. I secured the gate again, but I used an extra method this time. I brought a length of rope and tied it around the bars in a weird crisscross pattern. Then I used my phone to take photos, so I could make sure the rope was in the exact same position in the morning if it somehow stayed intact. I pocketed my phone, said goodnight to the caretaker's office, and left. I didn't stay to watch. Part of me didn't want to stand there in the dark. I didn't want to admit it, but my stomach felt knotted and my palms were sweaty. The next morning I drove up and felt a sudden jolt in my chest. The gate was open again. The rope was sitting on the ground, coiled up like someone rolled it neatly and placed it there. The padlocks were still hooked in place and the chains were intact. The rope wasn't cut or frayed. The knots weren't undone in a messy way. It looked as though someone had untied it with patience. I looked around. The area was empty. No footprints stood out, though the grass near the gate was pressed down in a few spots. That might have been my own footprints from the night before. I couldn't tell. My hands shook when I picked up the rope. My mouth felt dry, and I swallowed hard a few times. There was a tight feeling in my shoulders. I remembered the photos on my phone. I pulled it out and compared them. It was obvious the rope had been removed carefully. The chain and locks were the same as before. I stared at the gate hinges for a while. They weren't damaged or bent. Everything looked normal. It was like an invisible hand had done it, and I felt a chill roll up my back. That night, I decided to stay. I brought a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and a folding chair. My plan was simple: hide behind a large mausoleum near the entrance and watch the gate. The mausoleum sits about 20 yards away, angled so I could see the approach but remain hidden behind the corner. I got there around 9, drank some coffee, and settled in. The night air was cool, and my breath felt shallow. Each sound made me tense up. The wind in the branches overhead whispered and crackled. Gravel under my feet shifted when I moved. My flashlight sat in my lap, but I kept it off to avoid giving myself away. I thought maybe a trespasser or a prankster would arrive. Hours passed. I forced myself to stay awake. My neck ached from how I tried to peek around the side of the structure. The gate stood closed, locked, and chained. I could see the shape of it in the faint glow from the streetlight outside. Sometimes headlights from passing cars would brighten the area for a moment. Then everything went dark again. Around midnight, my legs were stiff and I had to stretch. I felt goosebumps on my arms because the temperature dropped. The coffee in my thermos tasted stale. I kept sipping, though, because I didn't want to nod off. By around 1 in the morning, I felt a growing sense that nothing was going to happen. Then I heard something like a soft scrape. It sounded like metal against metal, faint and quick. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I leaned forward. The gate still looked closed. I waited, holding my breath. Another sound came, like metal rattling, but very light. I switched on the flashlight and stood up. I didn't want to approach immediately, but I felt compelled. The small beam of light cut across the tombstones and the patches of grass. My throat felt tight, and I swallowed several times. I stepped out from behind the mausoleum and aimed my flashlight at the gate. I saw nothing unusual. The chains were still there, the padlocks still in place. But I felt a strange push of air move past me. I jumped back, shining the light in all directions. There was no one around. My stomach churned and I broke into a sweat. I called out, "Who's there?" My own voice sounded shaky. I listened carefully. No one answered. I heard only the breeze. I stepped closer to the gate, my heart thumping so hard it felt like it might burst. I examined the locks. They looked untouched. After a few more minutes, I decided to walk around the perimeter again. I wanted to see if anyone was hiding behind a tomb or crouching in the shadows. I wasn't sure if I'd find a person, an animal, or something else. I made a slow circuit, shining the flashlight in every corner of the cemetery. I saw old stone markers, small patches of bushes, and some broken branches. Nothing moved. The wind made a low moaning sound in the large oak near the back. I felt my pulse hammering and tried to calm myself by breathing in and out. When I returned to the front, the gate stood open. I swear it was closed when I left it minutes before. Now it was wide open. The chains hung on one side and the locks were still clasped. I stood there with my flashlight aimed at the entrance, my arm trembling. There was no sign of any person, no sign of how the chains had been removed. It was as if they slid through solid metal. My knees felt weak. I didn't know what to do. I felt cornered. My brain raced. I stepped forward and touched the chains. They were cold. They didn't appear broken or bent. I pulled on them and the locks held fast. It didn't make any sense. I shut the gate again and tested the locks. They were secure. My hands trembled on the iron bars. The sense that I wasn't alone overwhelmed me, but I couldn't see anyone. I stayed there, standing guard, for another hour. Nothing else happened. Around 3 a.m, I realized the gate hadn't opened again in that time, so I sat down on a nearby bench. Every so often, I would shine my flashlight around. The tension in my muscles refused to go away. My mind felt stuck in a loop, repeating the same questions. I eventually left at dawn, feeling ragged and on edge. I locked the gate again when I left, pushing the metal bars closed with a final clang. I came back an hour later thinking maybe the gate would be open again. It was. My face went hot. I marched right up to it, ignoring the chilly morning air. I pulled at the chains and found them still locked. They'd been separated from the gate in the exact same manner. I yanked them off, unlocked them with my key, and wound them around my arm. I walked straight to the caretaker's shed. Another volunteer was in there. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Morning." I told him what happened. He just shook his head and said, "That's how it goes. We don't know why. We just deal with it." Over the next few days, I tried more methods. I installed a motion sensor attached to a small camera. But each time I set it up, I found the camera shut off at some point during the night. Its battery was drained or the memory card was corrupted. I tried hooking it to an external battery pack. The next morning, the footage was incomplete. It was always missing the crucial moments between midnight and dawn. I tried multiple cameras, different brands, fresh batteries. Same result every time. I never caught footage of how the gate opened. At this point, I realized I might not be able to stop it. I couldn't stay up all night every night. I still had to go to work during the day. My nerves were shot. My stomach often felt uneasy. My hands felt shaky for no reason sometimes. I found myself jumping at sudden noises. I'd pass by the caretaker's office and feel a burst of anxiety. The other volunteers accepted it like a normal part of the job. They said people had tried to solve it for years. No one ever found an answer. Still, I keep locking that gate every evening. I can't just leave it open. It's my job to secure the grounds. I pull the chains tight, snap the padlocks closed, and tug the gates to make sure they're firm. Then I walk away. But I know that in the morning, I'll find them open again. Each time there's no sign of damage or any indication of forced entry. The locks remain intact. The chains are still locked. Something is free to move in or out, and I have no clue how it manages it. I keep volunteering here because I can't bring myself to give up on the place. It's old, quiet, and has a peaceful look when the sun is out. But I've learned not to expect an explanation. I've grown used to the rush of anxiety each night when I close the gate. I feel it in my chest, tight and relentless. My jaw clamps shut and my stomach tightens. I suspect something old and stubborn has claimed this cemetery as its own. I have no idea if it's a person or something else. I don't want to push it too far, but I also can't stop trying to keep the place locked. Every morning I return, and every morning I see that same open gate. The caretaker's shed sits untouched. The grass is damp from the early dew. The statues stare blankly at nothing. The wind stirs the leaves, and I stand there in silence. I swallow the lump in my throat and gather the chains again. Then I place them back in position, lock them down, and wait for night to come. It's the same cycle, and I expect it to continue. I see no sign that it will stop. Something or someone moves around in there, and I don't think it cares about my locks. I just show up, do my part, and hope I don't see anything worse than an open gate. I can live with that. I just wish I knew who or what keeps undoing my work each night. I never thought a simple closet door could wreck my nerves. A few months ago, I had no trouble sleeping. I'd go to bed, switch off the lights, and drift off. Then that scraping started, and now I can't relax like I used to. Every night, I wonder if I'll hear that sound again. The sound of wood dragging against the carpet. It's small, but it's harsh, and it shoots my pulse through the roof. I'm going to tell you everything that happened and how it's still messing with my head. I want to be very clear about what went on, because I don't like when stories get too fancy. I'm just going to say it how it happened to me. My closet is a large wooden piece of furniture. It's not a fancy walk-in closet or anything like that. It's an old wardrobe with 2 doors, each with a small metal knob. The hinges squeak a little, and if I open it, the bottom edge drags across the carpet. It makes this scratching sound. It's pretty distinct, like nails scraping a rough surface. That noise used to be normal when I opened or closed it myself, so I never cared much. But this one night I was half asleep, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, and I heard that scraping. It was slow, like someone was tugging on the door, letting it move an inch at a time. At first I thought I was dreaming. I lay there, heart beating, trying to figure out if I was awake. Then I heard it again. A slow scratch, then a little pause, then more scraping. My eyes popped open and I stared at the dark. My bedroom door was shut, and the only light came from the little glow under the door, because I leave the hallway light on sometimes. My curtains were drawn, so I didn't see much else. I sat up, then flicked on my bedside lamp. The scraping stopped. I looked toward the closet. The doors looked closed, but I was too nervous to be sure. Maybe it was only cracked open by a fraction of an inch. I slid out of bed, felt my bare feet on the carpet, and inched closer. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, and I noticed the sweat forming on my back. When I reached out, I grabbed the right door handle and gave it a firm pull. It was shut tight, like usual. I opened it just a little to check inside. Nothing was there but my clothes and a few boxes. I took a breath, closed the door, heard the familiar scrape, locked it with the tiny latch at the top, and went back to bed. I felt silly, but the adrenaline rush wouldn't go away. For the next few days, nothing weird happened. I started to convince myself that I'd been imagining things. Then, about a week later, I was exhausted from a long day at work. I climbed into bed, turned off the lamp, and rolled over. I think I fell asleep within minutes. I don't remember any dreams. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again to that same dragging sound. This time it was louder. It was like someone was pulling the door all the way open, letting it scrape across the carpet the entire time. I felt a jolt of fear shoot through me. My mind went blank except for that noise and a single thought. Who is in my room? I sat up too fast and my head spun. I fumbled for the lamp switch, flicked it on, and stared at the closet. Both doors were closed, but I know I heard that noise. I got out of bed again, marched over, and tried the doors. Both were shut, exactly as I'd left them. I opened each one, looked inside, patted around inside the closet to make sure nothing was jammed. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the air conditioner and my own breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself I might have had some weird nightmare. The next few nights, I slept better, mostly because I stayed up late watching TV trying to keep my mind off the closet. But the scraping kept happening. It wasn't every night, but at least twice a week I'd get startled awake by that horrible rasping noise. I took to leaving the lights on in my bedroom for a while, just to see if I'd catch the door moving. I never saw it budge when I was looking directly at it, but every time I turned the lights off and settled in, I'd eventually hear it. I started to dread bedtime. My chest would tighten up and I'd find myself checking the closet doors over and over. Sometimes I stood in front of them and opened and closed them repeatedly, trying to recreate that sound in different ways. It was always the same scraping, but it only happened by itself when I was half asleep. It felt like some bizarre trick. Then one night, I actually saw the door open. It wasn't my imagination. I'd turned off my light and was lying on my side facing the closet. My eyes were adjusting and I was trying to drift off. That's when I saw movement. It started slowly, a small gap forming between the door and the frame. The sound was faint, but it was enough to trigger my fear response immediately. I wasn't frozen. I leapt out of bed. My heart thudded, and my palms felt clammy. I stumbled to switch on the light, never taking my eyes off that door. By the time the light lit up the room, the door was open about 4 inches. Then I walked toward it, and as I got close, it closed on its own. It didn't slam or anything dramatic. It just closed gently, with that same slow scrape. There was no draft, no breeze. My windows were shut. I felt my stomach tighten. I stood there blinking, trying to understand what I'd just witnessed. I remember feeling this chill under my skin. I shoved the door open fast and looked inside. Nothing there but my clothes and a few old shoes. I checked behind the wardrobe, pushed it a bit to see if there was something mechanical or some strange hinge problem. It's just an old piece of furniture. After that, I decided I wasn't taking any chances. I dragged a heavy chair from my living room and placed it against the door so they wouldn't move. Then I tried to go to sleep. My mind was racing. I kept hearing that scraping in my head even though the room was quiet now. The next morning I felt tired and edgy. I went to work but I could barely focus. I had this new sense of paranoia. I didn't want to invite friends over because I didn't want them thinking I'd lost it. The only person I mentioned it to was a coworker, but I kept it vague. She told me maybe the frame was warped or the house was settling. I nodded like I believed her, but it didn't feel right. The door was moving in front of my eyes. Warped wood doesn't close itself like that. I tried ignoring it. Some nights, everything was quiet, but other nights, I heard the scraping again. It didn't matter if the chair was there. The noise happened anyway, and I'd sit up in the dark, panicked, scanning the room. My skin would feel prickly, and my breathing would speed up. My chest would get tight, and my mouth would dry out. I'd turn on the lamp or phone flashlight, grab the chair, and check the closet. Still closed, or sometimes slightly open. A few times, I found the chair pushed an inch or two away from the doors, like something had nudged it. I couldn't explain how that would happen. I tried to fix the door myself. One Saturday, I removed the doors completely from their hinges and checked all the screws. I rubbed soap along the edges, trying to reduce friction. I vacuumed the carpet around the closet to get rid of any lumps that might cause extra noise. Everything looked normal. I put the doors back on, tested them, and heard the same scrape. When I was done, I felt more frustrated than before. The scraping was part of the wood. No amount of tinkering was going to remove that noise. But I wanted the door to stop moving on its own. I even wedged bits of cardboard near the hinges to keep things snug. I jammed towels along the bottom to make sure the doors were secure. For a while, that seemed to help. I went about 3 or 4 nights without hearing anything. I started sleeping better, though I was still on edge. Then, around the 5th night, I woke to a thump. It wasn't just the scraping. It was like someone gently bumped the door. I sat up, turned on the light, and saw the towels I'd stuffed under the door lying on the floor a foot away. My throat felt tight. I tiptoed over and found the right door slightly open again. I tried to figure out how the towels moved. Maybe they slid across the carpet, but how? They were heavy enough that gravity alone wouldn't pull them out. I had shoved them in there pretty firmly. I decided I wasn't sleeping in that room that night. I grabbed a pillow and a blanket and I went to the living room couch. I left all the lights on in the bedroom. I remember lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from the bedroom. I didn't hear scraping, but I felt uneasy. My heart wouldn't slow down. It took me hours to drift off. I woke up the next morning with a stiff back and a headache. Eventually, I got tired of avoiding my own bedroom. I didn't want to live like that. So I moved the bed to the opposite wall, thinking maybe if I didn't have to stare at the closet directly, I'd sleep better. I placed a big trunk against the closet door. It was a heavy trunk full of old clothes, too heavy to move casually. With that trunk in place, the door couldn't open even an inch. I remember pushing it until it was snug against the left door. Then I wedged a small table and a few storage bins on the other side to secure the right door. My closet looked barricaded and I felt silly, but I thought it would help me rest. The first 2 nights were peaceful. I didn't hear a thing. On the third night, I woke up with a start. There was no scraping noise, but I had this strong feeling that something was off. I sat up in bed and looked around. The trunk was still in place. The small table and storage bins were where I left them. I didn't hear any rustling, but my pulse was up, and I couldn't calm down. I walked over to the closet, turned on all the lights, and checked the trunk. It hadn't moved. I let out a long breath, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. I felt like the tension itself was haunting me, even when nothing happened. But about a week later, I heard the scraping again around 4 in the morning. I shot up, clicked on the light, and stared at the barricade. The trunk hadn't budged, but the scraping continued for another second like it was struggling against the carpet. My spine tingled. I stood up, pulled the trunk back a few inches, and looked at the door. Still closed. There was no sign of movement, but the sound had been real. I heard every bit of it and my body reacted. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. My hands were shaking, and my legs felt weak. I just stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening. After a minute or so, I pushed the trunk back into place and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closet. That's basically how things have been ever since. On some nights, I sleep fine. On others, I hear that scraping noise and immediately jerk awake. Sometimes it's soft, sometimes it's louder. But every time I get that surge of anxiety, I jump up, turn on the lights, and see that the doors are closed or blocked by the trunk. I've checked everything 100 times. Hinges, flooring, even the possibility of small animals or something. Nothing makes sense. I put pressure against the door to see if it was warped in a weird way. I see no reason for it to open on its own, especially not with a trunk pressed against it. Yet the noises continue. People ask why I don't just get rid of the closet or move to a different apartment. The truth is, this place is convenient for me, and the closet is too big and heavy to just toss. Selling it or hauling it to the curb would be a hassle, and I worry that if I did that, I might start hearing doors in other parts of the house. It feels like the kind of thing that would follow me no matter what, so I stay here and deal with it. Now, I go to bed with my phone next to me, flashlight app open, ready to shine a light the second I hear anything. I keep a pair of shoes right by my bed in case I need to get up fast. I've learned to function on less sleep. Some nights I manage to rest, but other nights I'm up until dawn. Occasionally, the door doesn't make a sound for several days, and I start to think maybe it's over. Then it starts again. The scraping, that horrible, unmistakable rasp. And I sit there, in the dark or half-light, cursing under my breath, wishing I could rip that thing out with my bare hands. I've told you everything the way I experienced it. No fancy wording, no hidden meaning, just me, a closet, and a sound that won't let me live in peace. I still keep weight against the door every night. I still hear that noise sometimes. It hasn't harmed me physically, but it tears at my nerves. I don't know if it'll ever stop, but that's what's going on. That's my life right now, and I'm just trying to get through it one night at a time. I still remember the way my heart pounded that night. I sat on the edge of the bed in our old chalet, holding a flashlight, staring at the door. My palms were sweaty. My neck felt tight. I knew something was out there in the hall, but I didn't know what. I had heard the footsteps for hours moving back and forth on the old floorboards upstairs. My chest felt heavier every time those steps echoed in the quiet. I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, because it's not something I'll ever forget. It wasn't a game or a wild fantasy. It was real, and I heard it with my own ears. My family has owned this chalet in the mountains for decades. It has 2 floors and a small attic. The outside walls are dark wood, and the roof has patches of missing shingles. It's about a 3-hour drive from where we live. My grandfather built it long before I was born, and my grandmother spent most of her childhood weekends there. Over time, it became a place for our family to gather during summer breaks or on random weekends when we wanted fresh air and some peace. The chalet stands on a slope not too far from a narrow dirt road. Surrounded by tall pine trees and big rocks, it always has a strong smell of damp wood inside, especially in the mornings. Since I was young, I heard my cousin complain about weird sounds in the house, especially footsteps on the 2nd floor. He would mention it whenever we came up here together. He said he heard slow, deliberate steps in the corridor late at night. He would say it made him feel watched. I always shrugged it off and called it the wind or the usual creaks of an old house. My grandfather always said old buildings make noises. Timber shifts. Floorboards expand. I believed him without question. I even teased my cousin about it once or twice because he seemed so uneasy on those nights when we stayed upstairs. Last year, I decided to spend a Friday night at the chalet by myself. It was early fall. The days were still warm, but the nights were cool and crisp. My plan was simple. I wanted some quiet time to focus on work stuff and maybe relax with a few beers on the porch. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was setting and an orange light was slipping through the gaps in the trees. The chalet felt comfortable enough. I did a quick check of all the rooms, opened a few windows to air the place out, and then left my bags in the downstairs living room. The living room has an old sofa, a coffee table with chipped edges, and a fireplace that my grandfather built out of local stone. It doesn't look fancy, but it's cozy. There's a small kitchen area connected to it. The 2nd floor has 3 rooms, a master bedroom, a smaller guest room, and a kind of storage room that we rarely open. I planned to sleep in the master bedroom upstairs because it has a decent bed, and I like the view out the window in the morning. The hallway upstairs is just a short stretch with doors on each side. The floor is old pine. It's dark and has lots of knots. When you walk on it, it creaks. I ate a quick dinner around 7 p.m. I had packed some sandwiches and a few bottles of water. I left a small lamp on in the living room. Usually I'm not the type to get scared, but I wanted to keep the house somewhat lit so I could move around without tripping. Around 8 p.m., the wind outside started to pick up. I could hear it whistling around the corners of the chalet. Sometimes it rattled a loose window frame. I thought about my cousin and his complaints, but I shook it off again. I reminded myself that old houses groan. The wind squeaks through cracks. Nothing unusual. By 10 p.m., I felt a bit tired. I decided to head upstairs. I took my flashlight because the light switch in the hallway on the 2nd floor was always a bit finicky. I left the living room lamp on so there was a soft glow downstairs, but the staircase itself was dark. Step by step, I climbed the old stairs, hearing each one squeak under my weight. Everything smelled like musty blankets and old floor polish. I noticed a few spider webs near the banister and made a mental note to clean them up in the morning. When I reached the top of the stairs, the corridor stretched ahead about 10 feet. The master bedroom was on the right, the guest room on the left, and the storage room at the far end. I glanced around, but it was empty. The doors were all closed. I clicked on the overhead light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb was probably out, so I had to rely on my flashlight to see. I went straight to the master bedroom, turned the old brass doorknob, and pushed it open. The room smelled stale, like it always does before airing it out. I set my flashlight on the dresser, then moved to the bed. It's an old wooden frame with a firm mattress on top. My grandmother had put fresh sheets on it a week earlier because my uncle was there for a night. The walls in that room are plain, just a few pictures from the 1970s, mostly landscape shots my grandfather took. There's a small lamp on the bedside table. I turned it on. It flickered once but stayed lit. That gave me a sense of relief. I don't like fumbling around in the dark, especially up there where it's easy to trip over things. I kicked off my shoes, pulled off my socks, and lay down on top of the covers. I wasn't ready to sleep right away, so I just scrolled through my phone for about 20 minutes. The wind outside kept picking up. It sounded stronger, rattling the shutters. Once in a while, I heard a crack from the wood somewhere in the house. It made me flinch, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was normal. No big deal. Around 11 p.m., I started to doze off. My eyes felt heavy, and I turned off the bedside lamp. The darkness settled around me, and I could still hear the wind, but it was more like a background noise now. I curled up on my side, pulled the blanket over me, and relaxed. Then, maybe half an hour later, I heard what sounded like a heavy footstep in the hallway. It was just one, like someone had put their weight on a loose board. My eyes snapped open. My mouth went dry. I listened for a few seconds, but I didn't hear anything else. I told myself it was the wind again, maybe causing the floor to shift. But I couldn't shake the tension in my neck. I stayed still for a while. I didn't want to get up yet. I tried to breathe slowly and think of normal explanations. Just as I started to drift off again, I heard another step, then another. They were slow and spaced out, like a person walking carefully. I sat up. My heart was thumping so hard it made my chest feel tight. I reached for the flashlight next to me. I clicked it on. The beam lit up the bedroom door. The sound had stopped the moment I moved. My ears were straining, but I heard nothing now. I waited in silence, shining the light around the room. Nothing. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet pressing into the cold wooden floor, and I crept toward the door. Each step I took caused the floor to creak under me. I opened the door a crack and peeked into the hallway. My flashlight revealed the old boards, the closed doors of the other two rooms, and the railing near the stairs. No movement. No sign of anything. I took a few steps out of the bedroom and listened. I heard the wind, but not much else. After about a minute, I gave up and went back inside. I told myself it was nerves or the wind. I left the flashlight on the dresser, but I climbed into bed without turning off the lamp. My gut felt uneasy, and a slight chill ran across my arms and legs. I thought about calling my cousin to make a joke about hearing the footsteps, but I felt that if I touched my phone again, it would just keep me awake longer. So I stayed in bed, stared at the ceiling, and waited. After about 10 minutes of silence, the footsteps started again. They were soft but distinct, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. I heard 4 or 5 steps, then a pause, then a few more steps. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide, my breathing shallow. I felt sweat beading on my forehead. My stomach tightened like I might be sick. My mouth went dry again. The steps went from near the storage room door to the area right outside my bedroom. Then they stopped. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to check. I opened the door quickly and aimed the beam into the hallway. Again, nothing. The corridor was empty. No one was there. My heart was racing, and I tried to calm myself by taking a few slow breaths. I checked the guest room, shining the light through the open doorway. It was empty. The storage room was locked, and I knew I hadn't heard it open. Everything was exactly how I left it. When I returned to my bedroom, the steps started again. It was like something was waiting for me to be out of sight. They were heavier this time. I heard floorboards squeaking slowly, one after another. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was out there, was pacing. I felt dizzy. My mouth tasted bitter from fear. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing with questions, but I couldn't find a rational explanation at that moment. I slammed my door and locked it, even though I wasn't sure what good that would do. I leaned my back against the door, holding the flashlight in a tight grip. I felt my heart thudding against my ribcage, and each breath I took felt shaky. Then, as soon as I locked myself inside, the sound stopped again. The silence felt even worse. It made my skin crawl. I thought about running downstairs, grabbing my car keys and leaving. But the idea of crossing that dark hallway again terrified me. I felt pinned. I sat down on the bed, my back against the headboard, the flashlight still on. My breathing was loud in my ears, and I glanced at my phone. It was around midnight. Only a short time had passed, but it felt like hours. For the next hour, the footsteps came and went. Every time I stood up to check, they stopped. Every time I sat back down, they returned. There was no pattern to them, except they never happened while I was in the hallway. At one point I yelled out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked. No answer came. The steps faded for a few minutes, then started again. I got so freaked out that I turned on the small TV in the bedroom just for some noise, but it only picked up static. The sound of static made the atmosphere worse, so I turned it off. I left the flashlight on until my hand started to cramp from holding it so tight. Then I placed it on the nightstand, but kept it switched on, shining at the door. Around 2 a.m., I was still wide awake, my head aching from tension. My back was stiff, and my jaw felt sore from clenching my teeth. I started to feel cold, so I pulled the blanket around my shoulders. At around 3 a.m., the footsteps grew less frequent. I still heard them a few times, but there were longer pauses. My eyes were burning from lack of sleep. I fought to keep them open, but I dozed off here and there in small bursts, maybe for a minute or two at a time. I'd jolt awake whenever I caught a faint sound of movement. Finally, around 5 a.m., the first light of dawn appeared through the window. The sky took on a dark blue shade. The wind had died down, and the house felt calmer. I got up slowly, my body stiff, and peeked into the hallway again. It looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place. I felt silly and shaken at the same time. I decided to go downstairs and make some coffee. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I realized my legs were trembling. I gripped the handrail tightly to steady myself. I spent the next hour in the kitchen, sipping coffee and listening for any noise from upstairs. The only sound was the slow drip of the coffee maker and the soft hum of the refrigerator. When the sun came up fully, I mustered the courage to go back up and check every room carefully. Everything looked fine, just as it always had. No signs of forced entry or anything unusual. Later that morning, I called my grandmother to let her know I was okay. I didn't mention how scared I was, but I asked her about the upstairs hallway. I asked if she ever felt uneasy up there. She let out a long sigh. She said she was never comfortable walking down that corridor after sunset, even when she was younger. She didn't have an explanation. She just said it felt wrong. She didn't press me for details, but her reaction told me I wasn't the first to notice something strange. I packed my bags, checked that everything was locked, and left the chalet by noon. On the drive back, my nerves were still on edge. I replayed the night in my head over and over, trying to explain it. I don't have an answer. I can only tell you what I heard. Something walked those halls, and it wasn't just random creaks. Since that night, I haven't stayed there alone. I still visit with my family sometimes. My cousin and I have compared stories. He feels vindicated that I finally got a taste of what he's been talking about for years. I feel uneasy whenever someone brings up going back. The memory of those footsteps still makes my skin crawl. My grandmother just says the house is old and we should respect it. I don't argue with her anymore, that's the story. I heard those slow, deliberate footsteps. I checked multiple times. I couldn't find anyone or anything in that hallway. It sounds simple, but in the dark of that chalet, it was terrifying. I didn't see any shape or shadow, I only heard what I heard. And it wasn't the wind. I know the difference now. I guess that's all I can say. It happened, and it's real to me. And I won't forget it as long as I live. I heard the first thump while I was cleaning out the hall closet. It came from above, through the ceiling. The noise was short and dull, like something knocking against wood. I stopped mid-movement, dropped the duster, and stood there with my neck craned, staring upward. My father's old trunk was in the attic, and I knew exactly where it was, under the single dusty window, tucked behind an old dresser. He had left it there when he moved out of state, and I never had the nerve to open it. That trunk weighed a ton. It had a rusted padlock, and I had no idea where the key was. I kept telling myself it was full of old papers or junk he didn't want to deal with. But now, I heard a thump, and I knew it came from that trunk. I put my stuff down and climbed the attic ladder. The steps creaked under my weight. I flipped on the overhead light, which was just a single bulb with a pull chain. The air was stale and smelled like dust and old cardboard. I scanned the floor, looking for anything out of place. I didn't see anything unusual, but my eyes went straight to the trunk. It looked the same. Heavy, dark wood, corners bound with tarnished metal edges. The padlock was still there, covered in rust and a few spider webs. Everything was quiet. I stepped closer, measuring each footstep. I didn't want to make any noise that would drown out the sound. I listened, feeling my own pulse in my ears. There was nothing. I stood in front of the trunk, stared at it, and waited. Then I felt a vibration through the floorboards right under my feet. It was subtle, like the trunk had shifted an inch. My heart thumped. I crouched down and put my hand on top of the lid. It felt solid. The wood was splintered in a couple of places, and the metal bands had small patches of rust. I kept my hand there for a few seconds, and I felt a faint tremor. It was like something moved inside. I jerked my hand away and stood up fast. My breathing got uneven, and I wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans. The trunk stayed still. The overhead bulb buzzed. I glanced around at the stacks of boxes, the old dresser, and the rolled-up rugs in the corner. I felt like everything was watching me. I backed away from the trunk, then headed downstairs. My heart was hammering. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe the noise was something outside or a squirrel on the roof. I tried to explain it away, but part of me pictured something inside that trunk, scraping against the wood. Later that evening, I was in the living room watching TV. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. The volume was low. Then I heard another sound, this time louder. It was a scraping noise, like a metal hook dragging across a rough surface. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. I muted the TV and sat there, staring at the ceiling again. My stomach twisted. I felt a wave of nausea. I didn't want to deal with it, but the noise wouldn't stop. It came again, sharper, then silence. I turned the TV off completely and listened. My hands were shaking. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs again. It was the same routine. Climb the ladder, pull the chain for the light. The trunk was still in its spot. Everything else was the same. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. I almost didn't want to step forward. I didn't want to look at the trunk at all, but I forced myself to check. If there was a rat or something inside, I needed to know. Except that trunk was locked. I wouldn't even know how a rat could get inside. I circled the trunk once. My boots scraped against the wooden floor. I didn't hear anything. I touched the padlock. It was cold and flaky with rust. I pulled on it gently, and it didn't budge. I leaned down and tried to see if there were any gaps in the wood. The trunk's seams were tight. No holes. No cracks big enough for anything significant to crawl in. Still, I had heard something. I reached for the handle of the trunk's lid and jiggled it. The lid didn't open. I stared at it for a while. Then I stood up, walked away, and climbed back down. I was sweating. A few days passed. I tried to ignore the trunk. I avoided going up to the attic. I kept hearing faint noises from time to time, but I told myself they were probably the house settling or something outside. One day around lunchtime, I was in the kitchen, washing a couple of plates in the sink. The water was running, and I heard 3 loud knocks from above. I turned off the tap and stood there, my hand on the faucet. The knocks had been clear. It was the same spot above the kitchen where the trunk was located. It sounded like someone was knocking from inside. I felt an ache in my temples and my throat got tight. I dried my hands on a dish towel and headed for the garage. I knew I had a small hacksaw. My plan was to saw off the padlock and just open the trunk to see what was inside. At that point, not knowing was worse than anything. My imagination kept running wild. I found the saw and headed upstairs. On the attic ladder, I paused. My heart pounded. My mouth felt dry. I wanted to turn around, but I kept climbing until I got to the top. I flipped the light on and walked over to the trunk. I knelt by the lock and placed the saw blade against the rusty metal. Then I stopped. My hands were shaking again. The saw's teeth were pressed lightly against the padlock, and I couldn't force myself to start cutting. I stared at the trunk lid. I looked at the dusty surface, the worn edges, the old metal banding. Something about it felt dangerous, like opening it would unleash a nightmare. My breathing got shallow. My mind was full of questions, documents, old photos, something else. I stood up and lowered the hacksaw. My heart rate was out of control. I felt a tingling in my arms. I thought about what might happen if I opened the trunk and found something horrible, some item my father hid, something that would change everything. I realized I was afraid not just of what was inside, but of knowing. I didn't want that knowledge. I glanced back at the ladder, tempted to leave right away. Then I felt a vibration through the attic floor. It was stronger than before, like someone thumping from inside the trunk. My muscles tensed up, and the back of my neck prickled. I let out a short breath and hurried out of the attic, leaving the hacksaw behind on the floor. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned until almost 3 in the morning. Every creak in the house made me think of that trunk. I pictured it vibrating, maybe shifting, while I lay there with my eyes shut. My body felt clammy and I was restless. I kept trying to block it out, but around dawn I heard another noise. It was like a slow drag, as if something was scraping the inside of the lid. My chest felt tight, and I sat up in bed. I could almost feel the trunk in my mind, like it was calling me. I thought about dragging it out of the attic and throwing it in the backyard. Maybe I could dump it at the junkyard. But the trunk was massive, and I had no idea how I'd haul it down the narrow attic ladder by myself. For the next few days, I avoided the attic entirely. I kept the door to the attic ladder shut. I tried to keep busy. I worked overtime at the office. I forced myself to watch movies in the evenings. I wore headphones to drown out any noises. But sometimes, late at night, I'd swear I felt small vibrations in the ceiling above me. Each time, my heart fluttered. My palms would start to sweat and I'd feel goosebumps on my arms. One afternoon, I decided to go back up and face it. I grabbed a flashlight, plus a small crowbar from the garage. My plan was to pry the trunk open if possible. I told myself I had to know. I couldn't keep living like this, terrified of a piece of old furniture. I climbed the ladder again and found the trunk exactly where it was. The hacksaw was lying on the floor next to it. The overhead light seemed dimmer than usual, maybe because the bulb was old. I stood in front of the trunk with the flashlight in one hand and the crowbar in the other. My legs felt weak, and my breathing was shaky. I jammed the crowbar against the edge of the lid where the rusted metal bracket held it in place. I tried to wedge it in, but there wasn't much room. The trunk's lid was fitted tightly. I tapped the crowbar with my hand. The bracket groaned, but didn't give. I pressed harder. My arms trembled with the effort. I pushed and felt the metal shift a little, but not enough to break it. I got frustrated and tried again, pushing with all my weight. The bracket bent slightly, but the lid stayed shut. I sat back, panting. The trunk made no sound. I wondered if I was damaging something inside. I set the crowbar down. As I caught my breath, I felt that vibration again. It was gentler, just a small movement from within the trunk. The hairs on my arm stood up. I stared at the lid. Nothing else happened. I began to wonder if I should just call someone, maybe the police or a locksmith, but I felt embarrassed at the idea of calling the authorities for a trunk that might just contain old magazines. I decided to leave it alone again. I couldn't break the lock without more tools or maybe an electric saw. The thought of going through that much trouble made me feel sick with anxiety. I grabbed the hacksaw and the crowbar and climbed back down, switching off the light on my way out. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the tools. After that, I started hearing more knocking at random times. Sometimes it was midday, sometimes late at night. It always seemed to come in sets of 2 or 3 knocks, or a single scrape that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but each time I heard a sound, I'd freeze. My heart would pound, and my stomach would tighten. I could feel the panic creeping over me. The more I heard it, the more I regretted not hauling the trunk outside and smashing it to pieces. But every time I pictured doing that, I also imagined what I'd find once I broke it open. That thought kept me stuck. I was terrified of seeing inside that trunk. One morning, I walked into the upstairs hallway and noticed a small crack forming in the attic ceiling. It ran in a short diagonal line. I reached up to touch it. A bit of plaster dust flaked off on my fingertip. My chest felt heavy. I wondered if the trunk was shifting its weight or if it had started causing pressure on the floorboards. My father had warned me that the attic floor wasn't the strongest. He used to keep only lightweight boxes up there, but for some reason he left that massive trunk behind when he moved. Now it was sitting in one spot, making me question everything. I felt sweat beading on my forehead. I went down to the living room, trying to calm myself with some coffee. The entire time I drank it, my hand shook, and I spilled a few drops on the table. I decided to get rid of the trunk. I didn't care what was inside anymore. I didn't care if it was a family heirloom or a stash of worthless papers. I wanted it gone. I found a couple of thick rope lengths in the garage, thinking I could tie them around the trunk and try to drag it to the ladder, then lower it somehow. But it felt impossible to do alone. I needed a friend or two to help. But I also didn't want to explain why the trunk was so scary. I was embarrassed. I imagined telling them, "Yeah, I think something's banging around inside." They'd think I was losing my mind or acting paranoid. So I spent the next few days looking for a local hauling service. I found one, but then I hesitated to call. I didn't know if they'd just toss it in the back of a truck or want to open it first. My nerves were shot. Each day I paced around the house waiting for the next scrape or thump. It always came. Sometimes it was soft, sometimes loud. Sometimes the trunk seemed to vibrate for several seconds before going quiet. Each time my body tensed up, and I felt goosebumps on my neck. Last night I almost slept in my car. Around midnight I heard 3 loud knocks in a row, like hammer blows from inside the attic. They rattled the ceiling. I grabbed a baseball bat and stood in the hallway staring up at the attic door. My pulse raced. The knocks stopped and I stood there, bat in hand, for almost 5 minutes. My mouth felt dry, and my eyes burned from not blinking. Eventually, I went back to bed, but lay there wide awake until morning. Now I'm sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, writing down what happened. I'm still shaking. I can hear the occasional scrape from upstairs. My muscles are tense and my scalp feels tight. Every time I sense a vibration, I grip the edge of the table and breathe fast. I keep telling myself to call someone, anyone, but I can't bring myself to do it. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's the fear of looking foolish. Maybe it's the fear of the unknown. The trunk is still up there, locked, rusted, and heavy. I don't know what's inside. I'm not even sure I want to know. But every time the house goes quiet, I pick up faint sounds from above, and I feel that mild shaking coming through the ceiling. I regret not taking that trunk to the curb the day my father left it here. I regret not cutting the lock off when I first had the chance. Now I'm stuck with it. I'm stuck with the noises, the vibration, and my own dread. I can't think about anything else. My father's trunk won't let me. I'm just sitting here, listening. My heart won't stop thumping and I can't relax. I feel like any moment now the trunk will start knocking harder and I'll jump out of my seat. I can't block it out. I don't know how much longer I can stand this. I don't see a solution that doesn't involve risking whatever's inside, but I can't live with these sounds either. Every time I hear one, I feel a chill run down my arms, and my stomach twists in knots. My skin feels clammy, and I start sweating all over again. I'm not sleeping well, and I'm always jumpy. I still don't know what I'm going to do about this trunk. I keep thinking about using the hacksaw again, or maybe renting a heavy-duty bolt cutter, but something holds me back. My body seizes up, and I can't move forward with the plan. The noises won't stop. They never last long, but they're always strong enough to send my pulse skyrocketing. And each time I hear them, I hate this trunk more and more. I hate that I didn't throw it out years ago. Now I'm caught in this cycle of waiting, fearing, and imagining the worst. And I can't bring myself to do anything definite about it. So I sit here, and I listen, and I hope that somehow this will end. But deep down, I know it won't. Not until I face whatever is locked inside. And at this point, I'm not sure I'll ever be ready. I'll be honest right from the start. I never liked walking home under that viaduct. The place always felt wrong to me. It's cramped, there's barely any light, and the air feels heavy. I usually keep my eyes straight ahead and my pace quick. But something started happening a few months ago that made everything worse. I started hearing these low whispers in the darkness. They seemed close, like people were gathered in small clusters just out of sight. Sometimes I heard muffled laughter. Other times I could swear someone said my name. It felt like I was walking into a place where I wasn't welcome, like I was crashing some gathering that wasn't meant for me. It all sounds strange, but that's how it began. It wasn't some gradual thing. I noticed it one evening and then it became almost a nightly occurrence. I work an office job in the city. I usually leave around 7 p.m., and by the time I reach the viaduct, it's already dark or close to it. This particular viaduct spans about 50 feet, with concrete walls on both sides and a few weak overhead lights that flicker at random times. On most days, there are cars passing by above, but you only hear them faintly. The space underneath always feels stale, like a sealed chamber. I'd walk through, hearing my own footsteps echo. Then I started catching these faint voices. They were too faint to make out at first. I'd just hear a quiet chatter, as if 2 or 3 people were whispering. I remember the first time I really noticed them. I stopped walking for a second, turned my head and listened. The voices went quiet. I tried to see if anyone was around, but the corners are dark and the lights don't help much. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe a couple of people were on the far side. I went home, feeling a bit rattled but not entirely scared. The next day, the whispers returned, a bit louder. It made me tense. I felt a knot in my stomach. I started walking faster until I reached the other side. The moment I stepped out into the brighter street, the voices vanished. It was like a switch had flipped off. At first, I assumed it might be some homeless group staying there. It wouldn't be unusual in that area. I called the police a few days later because the noise was getting too creepy. I thought maybe there was some camp hidden behind the concrete columns. The police showed up, walked around, used flashlights, but found no one. They told me it was empty, that there weren't any signs of bedding or personal items. One officer asked if I might have heard echoes from somewhere else. I didn't want to argue, so I just nodded. They left, and I had a weird feeling in my chest. My heart was thumping. I felt a bit foolish for calling them. But the next day, the whispers were back, just as I approached the midpoint of the viaduct. By then I was really on edge. I tried wearing headphones to block out the noise. That worked for a few days, or at least I thought it did. But one night, even with music playing, I heard these faint murmurs underneath the sound. I pulled out one earbud, and the whispers were still there, echoing off the walls. My body tensed up. I felt sweat on my forehead. I was breathing faster. My mind raced with questions. Who are these people? What do they want? Why do they keep saying my name? Because by that point, I was sure I heard my name a few times, like someone going, "Psst. Hey, Mark." I started dreading my walk home. A few times I considered taking a different route, but that would add another 20 minutes to my trip. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just random noise echoing from somewhere else. But it always felt too close, too specific. The worst part was the laughter. It was never loud. It was like a soft chuckle that made the hair on my arm stand up. It felt like these whispers were mocking me or inviting me into something I couldn't see. One night I decided I had to check for myself. I left work a bit earlier, trying to beat the darkness. When I got to the viaduct, it was still dim. There was this gloomy light slipping in from the setting sun, but it wasn't enough to illuminate the corners. The place smelled like damp concrete and car exhaust. I walked slowly, peering around with my phone's flashlight. My heart was pounding in my ears. I looked behind the pillars and scanned the walls. Nothing. I couldn't see any signs of life. But I felt something. It was like the air pressed against my skin. It felt colder than usual, and I noticed goosebumps on my arms. I stood there, phone flashlight pointing around, trying to see if there was a hidden alcove or something that I had missed. The walls were solid, covered in random graffiti tags. My own footsteps echoed back at me. The overhead light flickered once or twice. That's when I heard the whisper right behind me, like someone standing a foot away. It was a soft, hushed voice. It sounded like, "Mark." I spun around so fast I almost dropped my phone. There was no one there. I yelled out something like, "Who's there?" My voice echoed. My pulse was racing. My chest felt tight, and I noticed my mouth was dry. I decided to back away. As soon as I moved toward the exit, I heard faint giggles. They weren't hysterical laughs. They were those quiet, mocking laughs that you get when people are messing with you. I took a few more steps, and the laughter and whispers seemed to follow like they were trailing me. The second I stepped out into the street, it all went silent again. My shoulders felt stiff, and I realized I'd been clenching my jaw the entire time. I went home, locked my door, and tried to calm down. I kept telling myself there must be a logical explanation. Over the following weeks, I experimented. I walked slower under the viaduct sometimes, and other times I ran through it. Running just made the adrenaline spike worse, but the effect was the same. I heard whispers, laughter, or my name once or twice, then nothing when I left the darkness. The tension built up in my chest every time I approached. My legs felt shaky. My palms got sweaty. I started to feel this sense of dread about 15 steps before I even entered that place. Some days I'd linger outside, contemplating if I should just take the longer route, but I often pushed myself to keep going because it was late, and I was tired. I tried filming with my phone one night, hoping to capture some evidence. I held my phone up, recording video with the flashlight on. I walked at a normal pace. I heard the whispers, clear as day. They were all around me like a quiet crowd. My heart was in my throat, but I kept moving forward. I didn't say anything, but inside I was thinking, I'm going to prove you're real. The moment I got out, I stopped the recording and played it back. There was nothing but static and the sound of my footsteps. No voices, no laughter. I felt my stomach twist. I played it again in my apartment, with headphones, straining to hear. Nothing. Just me breathing, and the echo of my steps. I started doubting my own senses. Maybe I was hallucinating from stress or exhaustion. Work had been tough and I wasn't sleeping well, but it felt so real. My ears would buzz with leftover tension even after I got home. Sometimes late at night, I'd recall the sound of my name whispered in that echoing darkness. I tried confiding in a coworker, but he looked at me like I was telling a ghost story. He joked that I should carry pepper spray or something. I laughed it off in the moment, but inside I felt isolated. A month after this started, I decided to call the police again, but not to file a report. I just asked if they had any updates about unusual activity under that viaduct. They said no. They hadn't gotten any other calls, and the officers who checked before didn't see anything suspicious. I thanked them and hung up, feeling an uneasy knot in my gut. One day I left work later than usual. It was close to 9 p.m., and the sky was pitch black. I was bracing myself for that walk. As I neared the viaduct, my shoulders tensed up and I took a deep breath. I passed under the first light, which was flickering. The area smelled like wet pavement because it had rained earlier. My shoes made this splashing sound in a small puddle. I heard a whisper to my left. Something like, "He's here." But it was so soft I wasn't entirely sure. I glanced that way, shining my phone, and saw nothing. I kept walking, trying to focus on moving forward. That's when a loud hiss broke the silence. It was like a rush of air, but it sounded almost like an exhale from multiple people. I froze. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it was in my throat. My mind screamed to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck. I couldn't see anything except the dark spaces behind the pillars. My breath got shallow. I muttered, "What do you want?" My voice echoed back at me, sounding shaky. There was no immediate answer, just a distant chuckle. Then I took a step forward, and as soon as I did, I heard my name again, much clearer than before. Mark. I bolted. My feet splashed in the puddles, and I rushed out into the open streetlight on the other side. As usual, the second I emerged, everything went silent. My chest was heaving, and I felt my hands trembling. A few people walked by, giving me strange looks. I tried to compose myself and walked the remaining few blocks to my apartment. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting something or someone to come out of the darkness behind me, but no one ever did. I started wondering if I should change my schedule, maybe request to leave while it's still daylight, but work doesn't really allow that flexibility. I also thought about driving, but I don't own a car, and public transport doesn't get me close to my apartment. I felt cornered. I had to keep passing under that viaduct night after night, hearing the same whispers, the same suppressed laughter. A few weeks ago, I decided to try a different approach. I armed myself with a bright flashlight, one of those heavy-duty ones that security guards use. I walked under the viaduct, shining the light in every direction, slow and methodical, looking for anything. The voices started as I reached the center. They didn't sound panicked or angry. It was like they were amused. I could hear them moving around me, but I couldn't see a single shape. The beam of my flashlight showed nothing but damp concrete and garbage on the ground. My body reacted on instinct. I felt a chill down my back, and I gripped the flashlight tighter. My jaw clenched. My breath got stuck in my throat. I turned in slow circles, shining the light. It felt like the voices surrounded me, but no matter where I pointed that beam, there was only empty space. I yelled, "Show yourself." I was angry at that point. My heart was hammering, but I was also frustrated. I'd had enough of feeling terrified. I was shaking, but I wanted to face whatever was messing with me. I stood there a few seconds, breathing hard, light pointing around. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this short burst of laughter, really close to my ear. I spun around, but it was just darkness. I could feel my pulse throbbing. My eyes stung with sweat. I realized I couldn't handle it. I rushed out again, the flashlight jumping around in my hand. When I reached the end, the voices stopped, as they always do. Since then, nothing has changed. Every time I go under that viaduct, the same thing happens. I hear them. They whisper my name. They laugh. They move around me in the darkness, but I never see them. I can't record them. I can't prove they're there. Sometimes I wonder if it's all in my head, but it feels too real, too immediate. My body reacts with genuine fear. My heart pounds. My muscles tighten. My stomach turns. I can't imagine this level of stress being a simple trick of the mind. It's like a recurring nightmare that I can't escape because it's right there on my route home. I don't know what they are. I don't know if they're people messing with me or if they're something else. The cops didn't find anything, and I've never seen a single person lurking there. But the voices are consistent. They always greet me in that same mocking way. It's like I'm intruding on a private gathering. The moment I leave that shadowed area, it's gone, like I stepped out of another world. I still don't have an answer. Every night, I grit my teeth, walk quickly, and try not to show fear. Most times, my chest feels tight and my eyes dart around. I keep my flashlight or my phone ready, but it never helps me see anything. The air still feels heavier under there, and the voices still sound exactly the same. They mutter and whisper, and sometimes they laugh. On rare nights, they call me by name. My legs always shake when that happens, and my breath comes in short bursts. When I finally reach my apartment, I sit down for a few minutes, trying to relax. My heart eventually settles, but the memory of those voices sticks around. It's not something I can forget easily. I haven't told many people about this. Most folks would think I'm crazy or making up stories, but this is what I deal with. It's real to me. I feel it. I hear it. I can't ignore it. I don't know what those whispers want. Maybe they want nothing at all. Maybe they're just there, like some leftover echo. But it feels personal every time they say my name. It feels directed. I've run through all kinds of ideas in my head. Ventriloquists, hidden speakers, pranks. None of them make sense. The police would have found something. The camera on my phone would have picked up some hint. Yet I end up with nothing. For now, I live with it. I walk under that viaduct, bracing myself for the soft voices that seem to rise from the shadows. I listen to their laughter, short and cruel. I feel the tightness in my chest and the tingling on the back of my neck, and I keep moving forward until the light of the street lamp hits me. Then I'm free. But I know the next night it'll happen again, and I have no clue how to make it stop. All I can do is keep my head down, keep walking, and hope that one day, maybe, they'll lose interest. Until then, I'm stuck with this nightly reminder that something out there is waiting in the darkness, whispering my name. I've always been a light sleeper, so it didn't take much to push me toward installing a chain on my front door. I'm not talking about the usual deadbolt that comes with the place. I'm talking about a second, thicker chain that I mounted myself, anchored in 2 spots to make it extra secure. I did it to feel safer at night, but I never expected it would lead to anything strange. Now I wish I could sleep without checking if that chain is still locked in place every time I wake up. I live alone in a small apartment building near a busy street. Trucks and buses rumble by during the day, so I originally chalked up a lot of noises and vibrations to normal city life. I figured any movement on the doors or windows probably came from that. But sometimes, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd wake up, thirsty as hell, and head to the kitchen. My kitchen is down a short hallway that passes through the living room. My front door is across that living room. One night, about 2 weeks after I installed the chain, I woke up with a dry mouth. My bedroom door was open, and I stepped into the hallway like always. The hall light was off, so I relied on the dim glow from a street lamp that filtered in through the blinds in the living room. I took a few steps and glanced over at the door, a habit I developed after installing the chain. I saw it swing lightly, just a small movement, but the chain itself was shaking like something had touched it. I froze. At first, I tried to figure out if maybe I'd bumped into something that caused a vibration. My heart thudded, but I couldn't see anything. Nothing had bumped the door. There were no trucks passing by outside. The street was pretty quiet. I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway either. I slowly walked up to the door, put my hand on the chain, and felt it swinging in tiny arcs. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, watching it slow down. After that, I unhooked it, opened the door, and peeked outside. The hallway of the building was empty. Nobody there. No sounds of footsteps on the stairs. I remember locking the door again and hooking the chain, then getting my water and heading back to bed. I didn't sleep well. My thoughts were stuck on that chain moving. I spent the night thinking there was some rational explanation, like a truck rumbling past. I told myself it was probably nothing, but that small movement stuck with me. It felt odd, like someone had just flicked it and stepped out of view. The next morning, I checked the screws on the chain. I tested it by opening and closing the door a few times, then waited to see if anything made it shake. When I slammed the door, the chain rattled a bit, but it wasn't the same kind of movement I'd seen that night. That night, it looked like a gentle, steady sway, almost as if a hand had lifted it and let it drop. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was my nerves or maybe the building settling. I didn't mention it to anyone. It didn't seem important enough at the time, and I didn't want people thinking I was jumpy. Things went back to normal for a few days. Then it happened again. It was around 3 in the morning. I'd gone to bed late, and I woke up thirsty. I sat up, tossed off the sheets, and walked toward the kitchen. As I reached the living room, I caught sight of the chain in the dim light again. It was swinging. This time I felt a jolt in my chest. My stomach tightened. I crept closer to the door, which was still closed. The metal chain links were swaying back and forth. It lasted a few seconds. Then it slowed and hung there. I stood there, breathing heavily. My mind raced with all sorts of possible explanations. I put my ear to the door, listening for anyone outside. Nothing. I flipped on the living room light. The room was empty. No sign of a draft or anything that could have moved the chain. I tried jiggling the knob. It moved a bit, but the chain stayed still this time. I opened the door, checked the hallway, locked it again, and went for the water. My throat felt scratchy. My pulse was hammering so hard that when I brought the glass to my mouth, it almost slipped from my hand. After that second time, I started feeling uneasy. I stopped leaving my bedroom door open at night. I locked both the deadbolt and the chain, then closed my bedroom door and tried to block everything out. But each time I heard the slightest noise during the night, I'd tense up and hold my breath. In the morning, I'd do a quick inspection of the chain, just to make sure everything looked normal. It always did. A week passed. I was back to my routine, except I couldn't shake the awareness of that chain. One night, I stayed up watching television until around midnight. I turned off the TV, locked the door, checked the chain twice, and went to bed. Around 2:30, I woke up again with that annoying dry mouth. I felt nervous even before I sat up. My arms felt a bit sweaty. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just thirst or maybe a nightmare, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. I pulled on a t-shirt, opened my bedroom door, and headed down the hallway. I looked toward the front door. The chain was still. I gave a sigh of relief. I thought, maybe it's over. Maybe it was just a couple of freak coincidences. I made my way to the kitchen, flipped on the small light there, poured water into a glass, and leaned against the counter to drink. The tile was cold under my feet. I could feel my heartbeat slowing down a bit. Suddenly, I heard a quiet clicking sound. It was so faint that I might have missed it if the kitchen fan had been on or if the TV had been playing. But the apartment was silent. The only other noise was the hum of the fridge. That click came from the direction of the living room. My hand tightened on the glass. I set it on the counter and walked back toward the living room, slow and quiet. When I got to the doorway, I saw the chain swinging again, but it was almost done moving. It was just a gentle back and forth sway. I felt my pulse pound in my temples. I took a step closer, watching it. The door was still shut. The deadbolt was locked, and the chain was attached. It looked like someone had tugged on it or tried to slide it out of the bracket. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to think of any reason. Was there a draft? There was no breeze I could feel. My windows were closed. The door was solid. The chain wasn't loose. I reached out and touched the chain. It felt cold under my fingers, and I could still sense the tail end of the movement. I stayed there for a while, listening to my own heartbeat. I could smell my own sweat. I felt trapped, like I was missing something right in front of me. Finally, I forced myself to open the door again. I checked the hallway. Empty. I listened for doors closing or footsteps. Nothing. I closed it, locked it, stood on the other side, and just stared at that chain, waiting to see if it would move again. It didn't. I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing that chain moving on its own, as if an invisible hand had just unlatched it. I started to wonder if someone had found a way to slip something through the gap in the door and was messing with me. I measured the door gap. It's not that big, but maybe someone with a thin wire or tool could do it. But why would they do it so softly, and only at night when I'm awake? The next day, I went to a hardware store and bought a little motion detector alarm. It's one of those battery-powered gadgets that sticks to the door and frame. If the door moves, it sets off a short beep. I installed it in a spot where the chain was. I figured if anything jostled the chain, it would move the door enough to trigger that small alarm. I tested it a few times by opening the door slightly. It worked fine. That night, I went to bed determined to catch whoever was doing this. I wasn't sure if it was a prank or something worse. I forced myself to stay awake as long as I could. Around 1 in the morning, I was still awake, reading on my phone, when I heard a faint beep. It was so short I almost doubted I heard it. But I knew it was the motion detector. My heart pounded. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone for a flashlight, and hurried into the living room. By the time I got there, the chain was swinging again. The beep had stopped. The door was still locked, the deadbolt was still in place, and the chain was secured. I felt an adrenaline rush. I switched on the overhead light and flung the door open. The hallway was empty. There was no way for anyone to run off that fast without making noise. I stepped outside in my boxers, looked around, and saw nobody. I couldn't hear footsteps. I came back in, shut the door, and locked it. The chain was cool to the touch, and it swung for a moment before resting. I tried to test the motion detector. It was still on, still functioning, but it hadn't kept beeping because the door had only moved for a fraction of a second. I spent the rest of the night on the couch with the lights on, phone in hand. I kept expecting to hear that beep again or see the chain jerk, but nothing else happened before sunrise. The next morning, I took the chain off the door to inspect it. I couldn't find any defect or trick mechanism. I checked the door frame, the hinges, everything, all normal. I reinstalled the chain, making sure it was nice and tight. I even added an extra screw, hoping to eliminate any possible looseness. Then I tested the chain's movement with the door shut. It hardly moved at all when I banged on the door. It rattled, but it didn't swing in those smooth arcs I'd been seeing. That night I decided to try recording video. I set up my phone on a small shelf facing the door. I turned down the lights and left my phone filming. I went to bed but left the bedroom door cracked open a bit so I could hear if the alarm went off or if anything else made a noise. It took me a while to drift off. Every little creak made me jump, but eventually I must have dozed off. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The apartment felt very still. I reached over to my nightstand to check the phone feed, then I realized my phone wasn't there. It was still in the living room recording, so I got up and went to check if I still had storage space or if the battery had died. I walked into the living room, and my phone was still propped up, but the screen was dark because it had been recording with the screen off. I was about to tap it when I noticed the chain. It wasn't moving. Everything looked normal. I stopped the recording and played it back, skipping through the footage at high speed to see if I caught anything. Most of it was just me walking out of frame, then silence. Then, about an hour and a half later, the chain started to sway back and forth on the screen. The door didn't open. Nothing else moved. I rewound that part several times. There was no cause on camera. I couldn't see any object touching the chain or the doorknob. It just started swinging slowly, almost like a pendulum, then it slowed and stopped. That was it. No alarm beep, no footsteps. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. I watched it again, searching the footage for any sign of light from the hallway or a shadow. Nothing. I shut off the phone, set it on the coffee table, and rubbed my face. I felt sweat on my forehead. My stomach churned. I felt a deep sense of frustration because I still didn't have a concrete answer. Now every time I walk past that door at night, my eyes lock onto that chain. I keep expecting to see it swing. Sometimes I stay up just to watch it. I do everything I can to check for any normal explanation. I look for drafts, vibrations, anything. It hasn't stopped. About every second or third night, I wake up to that chain moving like something just lifted it and let go. Every time I open the door, there's nobody outside. I haven't told my neighbors or the building manager. I don't even know what I'd say. I've considered moving, but that feels like running away from something I can't prove. I've also thought about removing the chain altogether, but that leaves me feeling vulnerable. At least with it, I know it's there, and I can see if it moves. Without it, I'd be left wondering if something's coming in or out without me noticing at all. So I leave it. Each night, I still lock my door and latch that chain. Each night, I glance over whenever I hear any noise. Each night, I wonder if I'll wake up again, look across the living room and see it swaying back and forth, taunting me. Sometimes I stand there in the dark, in my shorts and t-shirt, and stare at the chain until my eyes burn. And still it moves on its own schedule. Never when I'm fully watching, always when I step away. All I know is that something is making that chain move. I don't see a hand or hear footsteps, but I feel the tension each time I watch those metal links clink against each other. I've tried to rationalize it. I've tried to catch it in the act. I've tried alarms, video, everything. Nothing stops it, and nothing explains it. That's where I'm at right now. I check the chain when I go to bed. I check it again if I wake up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I find it swinging, sometimes I don't. But I never see who or what is causing it. and that unsettles me more than anything else. I still feel my stomach tighten when I remember that night. It was raining hard, and I just wanted to get home. My shift had ended late, and my usual bus wasn't running on time because of some route change. I was soaked by the time I spotted a taxi pulled up near the curb under a flickering street lamp. I didn't think twice. I walked toward it, opened the rear door, and slid inside. That was the start of the most unsettling ride I've ever experienced. I settled into the back seat and tried to brush some water off my jacket. The interior smelled like damp fabric and stale cigarette smoke. The seat felt cold, and I noticed a dark partition between me and the front. The glass was tinted, or maybe there was some film on it. I couldn't see the driver clearly. I only saw a faint outline of a head and shoulders. I cleared my throat. "Hey, can you take me to Oakwood Avenue, Building 14?" I said. My voice sounded louder than usual in that confined space. The figure in the front gave a small nod. I heard the sound of the engine revving lightly, and the taxi pulled away from the curb. I leaned back, trying to relax, but something felt off. The driver didn't say a word. No greeting, no question, no confirmation, nothing. I told myself I was just tired and on edge because of the rain. I looked out the window at the sheets of water sliding down the glass. The city lights looked blurry and distant. My heart was still pounding a little from running through the downpour. I tried to calm my breathing. I didn't hear any radio playing. Usually cab drivers have something on, music or talk radio. This one had nothing, just the rain pounding on the roof and the faint hum of the motor. I reached for my phone to check messages or maybe distract myself, but I realized the battery was almost dead. I clicked it on for a second, saw the low battery warning, and decided to save it in case I needed it later. I jammed it back into my pocket. The only sounds were the squeak of the windshield wipers and the patter of rain against the windows. We moved through a couple of intersections, passing only a few cars that splashed water across the street. The city felt oddly empty. I tried to spot the driver's face in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see his eyes or even the shape of his features. The mirror looked angled in a way that blocked my view. I leaned forward a bit. "Long night, huh?" I said. I felt my voice catch in my throat because something about the silence felt uncomfortable. There was no response. I cleared my throat again. "Yeah, it's a rough one out there." Still nothing. I could only see the faint silhouette of the shoulders and a slight shift of movement as the driver turned the steering wheel. My skin started to prick with tension. I reminded myself that not everyone wants to chat. Some drivers prefer quiet. No big deal. I forced my gaze back to the street outside. The neighborhood light streaked by and the water on the window kept distorting everything. My muscles felt tight. I shook out my hands, trying to stay calm. I noticed the meter's red numbers glowing. They seemed to climb pretty quickly, but I couldn't see the exact fare because part of the partition blocked it. I decided not to worry about it. I just wanted to get home, peel off my wet clothes, and sit down with something hot to drink. We turned onto a narrower road. The headlights bounced off puddles, creating quick flashes of light inside the car. I thought about trying once more to talk to the driver, but a strange feeling in my gut warned me not to. My ears felt hot, and my jaw was clenched. I looked down at my hands. They were slightly shaking. Finally, we turned onto Oakwood Avenue. I recognized the old diner on the corner. The place was closed, but its neon sign still flickered behind the metal gates. My building was just down the block. I felt relief flood through me. I couldn't wait to get out of that cramped seat. When the car stopped in front of my place, I grabbed my wallet. I expected the driver to say something like, "That'll be X amount of money," but I heard nothing. I saw the silhouette shift, as if he was waiting for me to pay. I opened the door and stepped out, letting the rain hammer my shoulders. Then I turned back, money in hand. I leaned forward to speak through the open rear door. "Hey, how much do I owe you?" I said, my voice a bit shaky. But I saw nothing. The partition was still there, dark as ever, and the driver's seat looked dim. I squinted. I couldn't see a single detail of a person. The entire driver's area looked empty. I felt my pulse spike. I walked over to the driver's door, which was closed. The window was rolled up. The engine was running and the windshield wipers were still going. The key was in the ignition, and it was turned. But I didn't see any hands on the wheel or any figure in the seat. I knocked on the driver's window. No response. I leaned closer, cupping my hands around my eyes to see inside. The seat was there, the steering wheel was there, but nobody was behind it. My breathing got shallow. My throat felt tight. The smell of rain and exhaust fumes filled my nostrils. My heart was hammering so hard it hurt. My mind raced. I looked around to see if someone had jumped out silently, but the sidewalks were empty, just the streetlights reflecting on wet pavement. I stepped back and stared at the taxi. The door was locked from the outside. The engine was on, the wipers were on, the interior lights were off. There was nobody in the front seat. I felt sweat mix with the rain on my forehead. I didn't know what to do. I glanced at my building's entrance. It was only a few steps away, but I couldn't just run inside. I had to settle the fare. I had to understand what was happening. I opened the rear door again. The backseat lights came on for a moment, revealing the partition. I still couldn't see through it very well, but the driver's seat area looked empty. "Hello?" I called, my voice unsteady. No answer. I wasn't sure if someone was playing a trick on me. Maybe the driver had stepped out for a moment, but the doors were all closed, the windows were shut. I felt my breathing speed up. I decided to leave the money on the seat. I counted out what I guessed was enough to cover the fare plus a tip. My hands were trembling. I placed the bills carefully on the cracked vinyl and looked around one last time. Nothing moved in the front seat. I mumbled something like, "I'm leaving the money," even though I doubted anyone could hear me. I pulled out of the car, closed the rear door gently, and took a few steps back. I stood there in the rain, watching the taxi idle. My heart pounded, and my legs felt stiff. I was soaked. The overhead streetlight flickered, making the car's paint look dull. I stared at the driver's window, half expecting it to roll down or reveal a face. Suddenly, I heard the engine rev. It was a quick burst of sound that made me jump. I stumbled back, splashing into a shallow puddle. The taxi's tires squeaked against the wet asphalt. The car lurched forward, headlights shining against the rain. Then it accelerated and turned the corner at the end of the block, disappearing from view. I stood there, water dripping from my hair into my eyes, completely confused. My chest felt tight and my arms were tense. I couldn't wrap my head around what I'd just witnessed. There was a car driving off without anyone in the front seat, or at least that's what it looked like. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the realization that something very strange had just happened. I hurried to my building's entrance, fumbling with my keys. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the taxi come back or park somewhere nearby. But the street was empty except for a few parked cars and the flickering neon sign of the closed diner. The rain kept coming down in heavy sheets. When I finally got my keys into the lock and stepped inside, the hallway light felt harsh on my eyes. My clothes were dripping water on the tile floor. I took a moment to gather my thoughts. I looked at my phone. The battery was almost dead, but I managed to turn on the screen for a second. No messages, no missed calls, nothing. I stood there trying to decide if I should call the police or at least call a friend to tell them what had happened. But the phone died before I could think of what to say. I climbed the stairs to my apartment and unlocked the door. My place was dark and quiet. I slipped off my shoes and jacket, letting them fall in a soggy mess near the door. My heart was still beating fast. I flipped on a light and walked to the kitchen. I felt a wave of relief just being inside my own space, away from that taxi. I poured myself a glass of water. My hands shook a bit and I spilled some on the counter. I drank quickly, trying to steady my nerves. Then I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was a mess, my eyes were wide, and my face looked pale. The fluorescent light made me look even worse, but I could see how rattled I was. I tried to process everything logically. Maybe the taxi had some automated feature. But that didn't explain why I'd seen a driver's silhouette, or why there was no one in the driver's seat when I tried to pay. I started pacing around my small living room, listening to the drips of water coming off my jacket and onto the floor. I turned on the TV for some background noise, hoping it would calm my nerves. A late-night talk show host was yelling at the camera, but I wasn't really listening. My mind kept going back to that silent figure behind the wheel, the tinted partition, and the empty front seat. After a minute, I shut off the TV. I walked to the window and peered through the blinds. I could see the street below. The rain had slowed, but the ground was still wet. A single car passed by, but it was just a normal sedan. I breathed out and felt a little tension leave my shoulders. I told myself that maybe I was just tired, and maybe the driver had climbed out for some reason at the last second. Still, it didn't add up. I checked the time on my microwave clock. It was later than I thought. I considered calling the local taxi company, but I didn't have the number on hand, and my phone was dead. I decided it might be better to wait until the morning to figure things out. I grabbed a towel from the bathroom and dried my hair. I changed into dry clothes, my hands still a little shaky. My heart rate was returning to normal, but every now and then, I felt a jolt in my chest. I thought about how bizarre it was that the car had just taken off with no one at the wheel. That image kept replaying in my head. Headlights bouncing, engine revving, and then the empty front seat disappearing around the corner. I didn't have an explanation. I was angry at myself for not pulling out my phone sooner to snap a picture, but I'd been too shocked. Besides, my battery was almost done. I turned off the lights in the living room and stood there in the darkness for a while. My ears were still keyed up, listening for any sound outside. I felt a slight chill on my arms, probably from the damp shirt I had been wearing. The memory of the partition and the silent shape sitting there made my skin crawl. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the drip of water from my jacket into the plastic tray I'd set beneath it. I replayed every detail of the ride, from stepping into the taxi to watching it vanish at the end of my street. My mind kept looking for some normal explanation, but I couldn't find one. My body felt heavy with exhaustion, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. Still, I couldn't rest easily. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the gray light of morning. My body ached and my mouth felt dry. My mind was groggy, but as soon as I remembered the previous night, I felt my stomach clench again. I charged my phone for a bit and then decided to see if I could find any record of a taxi near my place. I searched for local companies online. I called one or two, but they had no report of a car picking someone up in that area at that time. No one had any driver who matched my description of not speaking or ignoring a passenger. At that point, I felt a dull headache forming. I stopped calling around because it was just making me more tense. I kept telling myself it was real. I'd been inside that taxi. I'd smelled the cigarettes and wet upholstery. I'd seen the meter glowing. I'd heard the engine. It wasn't just a dream. I spent the rest of the morning trying to go about my usual routine, but the memory wouldn't leave me. I kept recalling the instant when I leaned in to pay and realized the front seat was empty. It made the hair on my arms stand up every time I pictured it. That night, I stayed in. I didn't want to deal with any late-night rides. I ordered food for delivery and made sure to meet the driver downstairs where it was well lit and normal. I felt a faint surge of anxiety when I saw headlights approach. But it was just a regular delivery person in a small hatchback. Everything was normal. Still, my thoughts kept drifting back to that taxi. I don't have a final explanation for what happened. I never heard a follow-up story on the news about some driverless cab roaming around. There weren't any police reports about a runaway taxi with no driver. As far as I know, no one else has had the same experience. But it happened to me. I was there, inside that car, listening to the rain, feeling the chill in the air, and seeing that silhouette in the front seat. All I know is that the partition was dark, and the driver didn't speak a word. When I got out to pay, there was nobody there. The engine was still running, and the keys were in the ignition. I left the money on the back seat. Then I saw that empty vehicle speed off into the night, turning the corner and vanishing from sight. I still can't shake the uneasy feeling that settled into my chest. It was the most disturbing ride of my life, and I doubt I'll ever step into a taxi again without thinking about it.